Chapter 61. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7 Human American. It hadn't taken us the full week to set out, thanks to Liath's familiarity with the Empire of Calcutti. I only had to wait 3 days before we hit the road. It was much easier to bear than Nash's training. Every time we stopped for lunch, he would drill me on the basics and then have me attempt to copy his movements. Then he would attack me while I tried to use the movements he demonstrated to parry him. It hadn't gone well, and he was getting grumpier with each failed session. Soon he would reach a critical mass of grumpiness and either explode or implode, likely taking the whole solar system with him. A supernova or black hole powered completely by grumpiness. Thankfully, our journey was nearing its end, for now at least. The first signs of civilization came into view, and I decided to take a brief nap to speed things along. When I awoke, we were on city streets. Buildings of stone and metal surrounded us, and dwarves were going about their daily routines. Well, mostly dwarves. Every now and then there would be a gnome, orc or elf doing something, but they were few and far between. It was easy to tell that this was a dwarven city even without the obvious architecture differences from the other cities I'd been to. "So where are we headed, Liath?" Nash asked. "Figured I'd drop you at the Venator's bureau so you can ask around while I park the cart," our dwarven driver answered. "I'll meet you there once I'm done." "Venator's bureau?" I asked. "Is that like the Adventurers Guild?" "Sort of. The VB is focused on monsters and doesn't usually take requests, though. The other big differences are that they only do contracts and don't allow solo adventurers to sign up. You need to be in a party of at least 3 and sign a contract to do work for them." "Why are we asking them questions instead of going to the Adventurers Guild?" "Because the AG is on the whole other fucking side of town," Liath laughed. "Plus, the AG is a lot less focused on dungeons around here. They focus more on requests, which usually end up being protection or gathering jobs. That's mostly because the dungeons in Calcutti don't have much treasure, so the profit is strictly in monster guts. So if you want to know all there is to know about dungeons, the VB is your best bet." And here they are. The cart rolled to a stop in front of a building that looked similar to the others, but with a lot more gold trim. Thanks to the tables and chairs off to the side of the building, it gave off a tavern-like aura. We hopped out of the cart, and Liath gave us a wave before he took off down the road again. "Well, the dwarf's logic seems sound," Nash muttered. "Let's find somebody who works here." We entered the building, and the tavern vibe immediately intensified. The inside of the Venator's Guild looked almost exactly like the taverns often depicted in video games and anime, right down to the bar and patrons. The only real difference was the amount of gold trim. There was a lot more of it on the inside than there was on the outside. I couldn't tell if we'd walked into a booze hall or a treasure vault. Once a few patrons did their obligatory double takes at my appearance, the room went quiet. Thankfully, it felt more like a shocked silence than a suspicious one. Nash chuckled as we approached the bartender and/or receptionist. The orc behind the bar watched us approach while shuffling some papers. "Greetings," he said. "Pleasure or business?" "Business," I replied. "We'd like information on the dungeons around here." Nash gave me an annoyed glance while I stepped forward and took a seat at the bar. "Yeah, we can do that. You able to read?" "Not any languages that anybody seems to write in," I laughed. "Fair enough. Figured you weren't from around here. You'll want a drink while you ask your questions?" "Yes," Yulk said. "Whatever's on tap will be fine." "Any allergies?" We looked at each other and shook our heads. "Good. 4 meads coming up." The bartender busied himself with pouring the drinks while Nash, Yulk, and Elmira took their seats. I watched as he poured, wondering if I should say anything about my age. After he poured the second glass, all the conditioning my mother had instilled within me finally kicked in. "You know, back home I'm not old enough to drink alcohol," I said. "How old are you?" Elmira asked. 18. "Well, last I checked. 18 years old and doesn't know how to parry properly," Nash sighed. "Your people must have it pretty damn easy." "Is it a cultural taboo or a medical necessity?" Yulk asked. "Cultural, I think. Legal drinking age in my country is 21, but in other countries it's lower. Plus, the law doesn't prohibit parents giving you alcohol, at least not in my state." "Your country has multiple countries?" Elmira asked. "Like an empire?" Before I could answer, 4 mugs slid down the bar and slowed to a stop in front of each of us one by one. My eyes widened as the bartender returned to his previous position. Elmira and my brothers seemed unimpressed, though. "How'd you do that?" I asked. "Practice," the orc smirked. "So what are you wanting to know?" "How many dungeons are nearby?" Nash asked. "Only the one. It was considered neutralized until just a few hours ago, actually." Neutralized? Well, the last time the dungeon was spewing monsters was over a decade ago. Contractors that went to explore it reported traps and kobolds who seemed to have a leader, but no loot or monsters worth a damn. Kobolds aren't worth anything? Maybe to a collector, but you get a lot more of the good stuff from their bigger cousins, and you don't have to listen to them yap at you. Plenty of folk take issue with hunting things that talk too. Since the kobolds weren't bothering anybody, the decision was made to leave well enough alone. "What are the kobolds' bigger cousins?" I asked. "Reptians and sauroids. Reptians are about as big as I am and have a neurotoxic venom that causes a total body paralysis, which can lead to death via asphyxiation. They travel in groups, have 6-inch claws, and hunt by spitting their venom at their victim and ripping them to shreds once they're paralyzed. Sauroids are much bigger and kinda look like a mix between a kobold and a troll, with a much bigger mouth though. They're solitary ambush predators that usually try to eat their victims whole. Both make for damn good hunts." "So why is the dungeon no longer considered neutralized?" Nash asked. "We've been having a bunch of disappearances, far more than normal. A couple from here in town, but mostly out on the road near the dungeon. Couple of adventurers found evidence that the victims had been taken into the dungeon, so we sent some of our own to check it out." He gestured over to the corner. My gaze followed his wave and saw a massive orc, 3 dwarves, an elf, and upright lizard that was happily eating a chunk of meat. It was my turn for an obligatory double-take. "They brought back a kobold that claims the dungeon has been taken over by vampires, at least 7 of them. The Western Wasters are brave, but not stupid. That's far too many vampires for 5 adventurers to handle. They made their way back to report, and we reclassified the dungeon as active." A somber silence settled over us at the mention of vampires. Rezun had spared no detail when he explained what had happened in our absence. My first thought was that the vampire that had led the drow may have taken refuge in the dungeon, but Rezun had said that half-breed vampires aren't able to make more. Something weird is going on here. "Do you think the disappearances in town were due to the vampires?" Nash asked. "I don't know. It's hard to believe that they could make it through the gates, especially since there's a nightly curfew." An odd feeling, like a soft nudge, tugged at the back of my mind. Too many coincidences. We're looking for dungeons that were inhabited by the cult, my brother's homeland was attacked by a vampire, and there's a dungeon with vampires on our first stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that it's been waiting for us somehow. "We should talk to them," I said. "I feel like this might be the dungeon we're after." "You going to take a drink of your mead first?" Nash grinned. I looked at my untouched mug of mead. My friends back home hadn't been the type to throw parties with booze, so the only time I'd ever had any was the beer my dad shared with me on my 18th birthday. The bitter taste of the beer echoed in my mouth, and I felt my stomach churn. Yeah, of course," I said, picking up the mug. "Don't worry, I'll prevent inebriation," Ten said. "Thanks." I took a deep breath and chugged the contents of the mug. It was much sweeter than I expected, but it burned a little going down. Once the mug was finished, I set it down and wiped my mouth. Once my sleeve left my mouth, a loud burp forced its way out. "Nice," the bartender chuckled. Nash raised his eyebrows as Yulk paid for the drinks. "Hope you stay on your feet after that," he said. "It'll be fine," Yulk said. "We're not going to be heading out immediately. If he ends up drunk, he can sleep it off." "If?" "Yes, it's possible that Ten will intervene." "That's cheating," Nash grumbled. Damn, Yulk saw right through me. I pushed the mug towards the bartender with a chuckle and heard a muffled voice. "Toxin resistance unlocked." "Really? That feels a little cliché." "Well, I guess the cliché would be more along the lines of someone with superpowers being unable to get drunk because of a resistance to poisons, rather than unlocking it while drinking." As I tried to think of an example of someone gaining a resistance to toxins from drinking booze, an evil thought occurred to me. I, uh, I just unlocked a skill, I said innocently. It's called toxin resistance. I stand corrected, Nash replied angrily. That's cheating. The sour expression on my adopted brother-turned-trainer's face filled me with a sick glee. Seeing jealousy twist his features completely made up for all of the recent bruising. Yulk chuckled and shook his head. Well, that's a handy skill to have, he said. I would note that it says resistance rather than immunity, though. I pulled up the skill information and relayed it to them. Toxin resistance allows a user to resist 25% of the negative effects of a poison or venom. It doesn't have a cooldown or duration either, I added. I guess that means it's always active. That does sound like a handy skill to have, the bartender said, grabbing my mug and putting it in a sink behind him. I suddenly became aware of how weird this must look to the poor orc. Something he's never seen before comes up to his bar, asks strangely coincidental questions about dungeons, then downs a mug of mead and gains a new skill. And in the face of these odd events, he's managed to maintain his professionalism. He didn't ask what I am or act suspicious of me at all. To him, I'm just another customer. I reached under my cuirass and pulled a gold coin out of my coin pouch. I placed the coin on the bar and slid it towards him. Thanks for the drinks. You can keep the change, I said. I didn't catch your name. Thank you, he said, smiling as he picked up the coin. The name's Jums. I introduced myself and the rest of my party while they finished their drinks. Jums took our mugs one by one and placed them in the sink that mine had gone in. Well, it's nice to meet you, he said. You're welcome back any time. Oh, we'll definitely be back, I laughed. That mead was pretty good. All right, we should go and have a chat with the Western Wasters, Nash said, sliding off his stool. While they're still somewhat sober, that is. You're right, I replied. Let's go. Chapter 62. Gali Morathi, Adventurer Level 13, Dwarf Calcutin. Mako, Haino, and Ithrima talked amongst themselves about what the receptionist had told us. He had said that even though it will take a while for a team of specialists to be formed, coming back was the right call. If we had tried to take on the vampires by ourselves, we would have almost certainly died and become part of the vampire nest. I know it was the right call, but Rebus and I felt a bit bad about it. In the time it takes for another team to form, more people will disappear, and the nest will get larger and more dangerous. Part of us wanted to go back in to give it a try. An extremely stupid part of us, that is. To distract ourselves from these almost certainly suicidal urges, we'd been watching the overgrown lizard try to eat its weight in meat. It's a good thing the meat's cheap. So you like the food? I asked the kobold. Mm-hmm, it replied with a stuffed face. Voracious little shit, isn't he? Rebus muttered. The kobold tilted its head at Rebus and then unhinged its jaw to swallow what it had just shoved in its mouth. Rebus and I flinched in disgust as the chunk of roast direwolf slid down its throat. What mean? It asked. That word. Voracious. It means someone or something that eats a lot, I clarified. Is I eating too much? Nah, Rebus chuckled. The meat here is pretty cheap, and you probably saved our asses. So eat up. Can I just eat regular? Don't know how to eat up, it said, lifting its head and pointing its snout at the ceiling. Maybe can... What's that thing? The kobold shifted its head to look at the group approaching us. I had been keeping an eye on the outsiders the moment they'd entered, but they'd headed straight for the receptionist and hadn't caused a fuss. They were dressed as adventurers, not hunters, but it isn't uncommon for people from the AG to come around. Still, some of the groups closer to them had looked pretty shocked. I wasn't able to tell why, though. Maybe one of the elves is famous or something. Come to think of it, a pair of orcs with a pair of elves is kind of an odd sight around these parts. You should know this one. Those are orcs and Rebus stopped talking as he got a better look at the group. Actually, you're right. The fuck is that? There were indeed two orcs, but one of the elves looked off. As they walked up, I did a quick comparison and noted several discrepancies between it and the other elves. First, round ears. Second, wrong facial architecture. Third, its smile showed a few sharp teeth that shouldn't be there. Probably not an elf, I muttered. Hello, sorry to intrude. the Not Elf said. "We were told that you were just inside the nearby dungeon and found some vampires. We were wondering if you'd be willing to share some intel with us." Haino, Mako, and Ithrima turned to face the newcomers. Each of their eyebrows rose once they got a good look at the one speaking. The silence started to get uncomfortable, so I interrupted the awkward moment by sliding a chair towards the group. "Sure, but intel isn't free. Buy a round and we'll chat," I said. The non-elf thing took the chair while the rest of its group grabbed some more, and before long we were all sitting together. Once everyone was settled, I waved an order of drinks to the receptionist and gave a brief summary of the events that took place in the dungeon, including how we ended up with a kobold. "So at least 7 vampires then," one of the orcs said. "That'll be tough." "Tough is an understatement, brother," the other orc said. "It'll be hard for Nick and I to pin that many vampires down long enough for you and Elmira to blast them." The odd group began discussing entering the dungeon, and the rest of us settled into another awkward silence. I glanced at my party members, but they were still trying to figure out what the thing in front of us was. Even the drinks arriving didn't snap them out of it. I took a swig of the mead and sighed. "Well, since the rest of you aren't going to ask, I might as well," I said. "Don't mean to be rude, but what exactly are you?" "I'm a human," it said. "And that is—" The human laughed and provided a summary of the events that led to him being here, introducing his party as they became relevant to the story. Nick, a human found in one of the unified chiefdom's dungeons. Nash and Yulk, brothers from the famed Alta clan that had found and resuscitated Nick. Finally, the one that kind of set things on edge, Elmira the Eternal. When Nick got to her part of the story, Elmira looked nervous. Once she was introduced, it was easy to see the reason for her nerves. Here we were, having drinks to lament our vampire problems, when one strolls in and sits down with us. I almost laughed. "So what do you think, Gali?" Mako asked. "I think it's fine," I said. "I've heard a lot about the Altars. From what I've heard, they're not easily duped and don't associate with bad actors. Plus, she's kinda hot if you ignore the age difference, no offense, milady," Rebis said with a laugh. "I am Rebis Ultha. This here's Gali Morathi. The other dwarf is Haino Trant. Makomuko is the big-ass orc, and Ithrima Solal is our token elf mage." "Token, you little shit," Ithrima said with a growl. "Again?" Haino asked. "Do you actually have some sort of grievance against our height?" "What?" No, that's not what I meant. It's just a phrase," she almost shouted. Rebis and I laughed as she attempted to explain exactly what she meant by little shit. After a few stuttered sentences, she realized that the three of us were poking fun at her and started sulking. I finished my mug and looked at Nick. "We're the Western Wasters," I said. "We're named that because we're from the West and we usually hunt in the wastes. Lately we've been hunting in the dungeons, though." "Makes sense," Nash said. "So are you going back in?" "Yep." The kobold beamed. "Gonna kill the suckers. We has to help the Lord." "Wow, it really does talk," Nick said. "Yeah, it does," I grumbled. "Too much, in fact. Anyways, we don't plan on going back in. We're handing the job off to a more experienced group. A specialist party. How long do you think it'll be before they're ready to go in?" "I don't know. Might take a week or two for word to spread far enough to find the right hunters for the group. Then it'll take some time for them to get here, get equipped and acquainted, and finally get to hunting the vamps." "Why?" "We need to explore the dungeon," Nash said. "That dungeon's probably one of the cult's former hideouts, and they might know how to get Nick home. We're hoping some clue may have been left behind. If there's nothing, we'd like to know as soon as possible so we can move on." "Well, we'd love to help you out, but we don't work for free," Rebis said. "Plus, we'd need at least 3 more mages that know fire spells. Maybe another fighter to help pin the vamps down, too." "Would fireball work?" Nick asked. Rebis and I glanced at each other and then at Nick's hip, where a sword was sheathed. "Yeah, any spell that can light a fire hot enough to start burning flesh would work," Rebis said. "Why?" "Because Yulk and I know fireball, and I'm pretty sure Elmira can use fire magic too," Nick said. "Right?" "That's correct," the elven vampire said. "So that's 3 mages and a fighter," Nick continued. "How much do you charge?" "Shit. What are the odds of someone being able to use both sword and spell?" Rebis glanced at me, making me responsible for setting a price. I sighed and gave it some serious thought. The price needs to be high enough that they can't afford it, but not so high that we end up looking like greedy bastards. That will let us save face while also keeping us out of the dungeon. 2 gold for each of us, I said. A little high, but it's going to be a pretty tough job. So 10 gold all to... I was cut off by the sound of 10 gold pieces hitting the table. Mako laughed as Rebis and I stared at the glimmering coins. They were unified chiefdom and Bolissa minted coins too, which had a higher gold content than Calcutin coins. No arguing our way out of this one. Well, fuck, I said. I don't want to do it, but the gold's on the table. You and your big mouth, Gali, Rebis sighed. I'm willing to give it a shot, Mako said with another chuckle. I think your force analysis was pretty spot on, Rebis, and 10 gold is more than fair. Ithrima and Haino were silent for a few moments. Finally, Haino shrugged and sighed. Fine, I'm in, he said. Might as well add vampires to the list of things I've killed. I'm in too, Ithrima added. In what? A well-dressed but road-worn dwarf asked as he approached. What did I miss? Hi, Liath, Nick said. We found a likely dungeon, but it's filled with vampires. We're going to team up with the Western Wasters to clear the dungeon and explore it. Yes, kill the suckers, for the Lord, the kobold shouted, raising a freshly cleaned bone into the air. What? Liath asked with a horrified expression. Chapter 63. Rebis Ultha, Adventurer Level 12, Dwarf Calcutin. Once Liath was all caught up, we began celebrating our newfound partnership. We drank our drinks and ordered some more food, and the humans' party joined us and was kind enough to pay. Once everyone was done making a fuss over Nick's dietary needs, Meko and the other orcs got to chatting. Their talk was mostly about the unified chiefdoms, which might interest someone who loves to travel. Traveling is my least favorite part of being a hunter, though. Sitting in a cart or on a harness all damn day just to go to some place that people are going to look at you funny? Fuck that. My attention turned from the orcs, and I started listening to Haino, Liath, and Gali instead. But then they began talking about the political happenings in the Empire. An even more boring conversation than the one I had tuned out. I switched my focus to the slightly more interesting discussion that Ithrima and Nick were having. The start of their conversation made me grin. Haino and Gali are both level 13, I am level 12, and Mako is level 15. It wasn't surprising to hear that Nick's party was comprised of under 10s, except for Olmyra, who doesn't have a level. What I found funny, though, is that Ithrima and Nick are almost the same level. She's only level 9, and has been stuck at level 9 for over a year now. Everyone else in the party is an over 10, Olmyra asked. Yes, I would be too, but I specialize. Ithrima answered hastily. My interest lies in attack magic, fire, ice, and darkness to be precise. The only non-offensive spell I know is minor healing, and that's only because I'd be out of a job without it. Damn right, we don't have any use for a mage that can't heal, I laughed. How many spells do you know? Nick asked. 8 attack spells, but they're more powerful than you'll find from most mages. My magic core is just about average, but I'm able to make my spells more intense thanks to my studies and training. That's awesome, Nick beamed. I only know 7 spells, but only 4 of them are attack spells. I couldn't help but laugh harder. Ithrima is pretty pretentious about her magic, so this conversation has got to be needling her a bit. Of course, there's always room for more needling. He knows almost as many spells as you do, I said. Say, Nick, if the whole getting home thing doesn't work out... Shut your damned mouth, Ithrima growled. I'm under contract. You can't replace me even if you wanted to. I gave an evil chuckle and took a bite of my bell popper. The chefs had really outdone themselves. Bell poppers take careful preparation because the seeds pop when directly exposed to water. Since the plant already has water in it, you've got to be really careful while cooking it to prevent the seeds from prematurely popping. Each seed is filled with a sweet powder that's often used to sweeten other food items. The rest of the bell popper has a slightly bitter taste to it, so eating the whole plant turns into one hell of a culinary experience. It's one of my favorite foods. As I ate, the ladies explained how the impact of an attack spell is based on both the expertise and the amount of magic behind the spell. Essentially, a dumbass with a lot of magic can lob a fireball that's as intense as a smartass that only has a little magic. I chuckled again and asked if Ithraima was sure she had an average amount of magic. Before she could react, Mako cracked his neck and patted his pants. "This has been great, but I'm getting tired. We're setting out tomorrow, right?" he asked. "As soon as possible would be ideal," Yulk said, "unless we have a reason to stall." We all looked at each other, but nobody could think of anything. Our equipment was well maintained because we hadn't really used it, and it wouldn't take long to pick up the supplies needed for the hike. We all agreed that tomorrow would be the day of our raid and left the Venator's guild. We walked together until we reached our respective destinations, which happened to be across the street from each other. The inn that we were staying at wasn't exactly the worst place you could stay in this town, but they were staying at the Marfix Inn. It wasn't that surprising, considering how quickly Nick had dropped 10 gold earlier, but I still felt a pang of jealousy. The Marfix Inns are well known for their extravagance and luxuries. Massages, professional chefs, climate control, super soft beds with even softer bedding, and even hot water were standard in every inn. I'd always wanted to stay in one just to see what it's like to be pampered like that. Unfortunately, even their cheapest rooms run a whole gold piece per night. It's hard to justify that kind of expense when you might need to pay for equipment repairs. Even 50 silver would be a lot just to stay the night. Our inn only cost 20 copper per room per night, and we'd doubled up to save some money. Except for Ithraima, of course. She always played the female card to avoid having to share a room with any of us. I gave an exaggerated sigh as I watched Nick's party enter the Marfix Inn. Then I turned to look at Gali with papa eyes. "Absolutely not," he said. "But we have 10 gold," I argued. "It won't cost more than 5. "He's right," Mako said, with a lot less investment than me. "If we double up, it would only be 3 gold. "Yeah, 3 gold that will be sorely missed if we end up ruining our equipment tomorrow," Gali scoffed. "Plus, we already paid for our rooms here. They don't give refunds, you know." "Who cares?" I asked. "It's only a few copper. We could be dead tomorrow, Gali. We should live a little." "I'd rather be dead than destitute." "Oh, come on, it's not that bad. We'll still have 7 gold, and that'll be enough to replace most of our equipment. Plus, if we're successful with the vampire hunt, we'll qualify for better-paying hunts." "And what if we're not successful?" "Then we'll be dead and won't have to worry about it." I could tell that Ithraima and Mako were fully with me on this. Haino was being pretty aloof, but there's a good chance he'd vote my way if I called for one. But calling for a vote here would undermine Gali's leadership. Haino, Marco and I had previously spoken at length about who should be our next leader, and we'd settled on Gali. His even temperament and innate situational awareness would make him a great leader, but he's humble enough to decline the position if we tried to make it official. So naturally, we were trying our best to put him in that position without him realizing it. "Wait a fucking minute. Why am I the one making this decision?" he demanded, displaying his innate situational awareness. "'Cause you're the one carrying the money," I answered quickly, "and I don't want you to ruin our stay by bitching about how we aren't being miserly the whole damn time." As if I'd, "Gods above and below grant me patience. Fucking fine, we can stay at the Marfix." But I still reserved the right to bitch the whole time. Once I finished jumping for joy, we got our stuff from the inn and explained our decision to the very understanding innkeeper. Then we went across the street to check into the Marfix. I tried to play it cool when we went inside, but the sheer wealth on display made my jaw drop. It's common to see gold trim in Calcutan buildings. It's not common for that trim to have gems embedded in it, though. On top of that, in the center of the lobby was a multi-level golden fountain with water gushing out of the largest blue sapphire I'd ever seen. It struck me that 3 gold would be a bargain to stay in a place like this. We got a raised eyebrow from the front desk clerk, but other than that, he was very polite and professional. There was a small argument over who the kobold would be bunking with, but Ithraima finally folded when faced with the prospect of having to share a room with one of us. We surrendered the 3 gold, deposited our stuff in our rooms, and set off to enjoy the amenities. The first thing I did was visit the spa. I got a nice mud bath and warm rinse, then went to the sauna where I ran into Nick and Nash. "Hi guys," I said cheerily as I sat down across from them. "Pretty hot in here, isn't it?" "Nah, it's just right," Nash said gruffly. "Yep, not too hot at all," Nick wiped the sweat from his forehead. I grinned as I realized what I had walked in on. A tough guy competition was in full swing. I let out a sigh as I leaned back against the wall, knowing that I had the advantage because I had just walked in. "You're right, this is pretty nice," I said. We sat in silence for a time, allowing the heat to slowly bake us alive. Eventually, the last glimmers of sunset shining through the sauna's only window began to fade. Once the glow was gone completely and night finally settled, Nick cleared his throat and stood up. "While this heat is enjoyable, I think we should be going to bed now," he said with an air of diplomacy. "We have a long day ahead of us and will need our sleep." Nash and I looked at each other. On the one hand, the human's suggestion could be considered a sign of weakness, which would allow us to poke fun at him. On the other hand, he had a damn good point, and poking fun at him would result in us having to stay in the sauna longer to prove we weren't as weak as him. I grinned when I realized that Nash was also considering the fact that I had joined them late and had quite an advantage in this contest. "He's right," Nash said, standing. "We'll be heading to bed. You?" "I might as well," I sighed. I followed Nick and Nash out of the sauna and chose a shower stall to rinse off. The cold water was an extreme contrast to the heat of the sauna, and I had to struggle to maintain my composure. Once we were finished, we nodded to each other and went to our rooms. Hino's snores greeted me as I entered the room. He had somehow managed to clean his gear, and it was currently laying neatly next to his bed. My own gear had carried the scent of kobold corpses out of the dungeon, so I'd left it for the launders. I disrobed, laid in bed, and tried unsuccessfully to fall asleep. At first, I blamed Hino's snoring. That didn't really hold up for long, though, because Mako's snoring is much louder. Once you sleep through that mountain of an orc's snores, you can sleep through anything. My thoughts turned toward tomorrow, and I realized that the reason I couldn't sleep was due to nerves. Vampires are one of the most fearsome opponents a hunter or adventurer can run into. They're smart, fast, and unnaturally strong. Plus, they can turn you into one of them. Even most legendary weapons can't do lasting damage to them, and all I have is a relatively cheap orc-made steel sword. It does the job against most other beasties, but stabbing a vampire will just piss it off. I don't even know how well my shield's gonna hold up against their claws. With a sigh, I rose from my bed. There's only one cure for nervous insomnia, and that's exhaustion. I remembered seeing a sign for a training area, so I decided that some exercise would do me good. Thankfully, it didn't take long to find the sign and follow its arrow. When I opened the door, I was met with the sound of wood smacking against a training dummy. I turned to find Nick practicing with a wooden sword. "Hey, Nick," I said as he turned to look at me. "Having trouble sleeping?" Yeah," he replied, fidgeting with the practice weapon. I thought I should get some training in. Need to be in peak form tomorrow." "Same here." I grabbed a wooden sword and shield and picked a dummy. Nick watched me strike at the dummy's neck for a bit, then left without saying another word. I watched the door close behind him, shrugging off the paranoia that came with that awkward interaction. It was definitely strange, though. I could swear his voice had sounded different. Chapter 64. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7, Human American. Once we finished our lovely breakfast and checked our gear, we began our hike to the dungeon. Larth stayed behind, claiming to be useless in both fighting and long walks. He acted pained when nobody argued with him. The hike itself didn't seem that difficult at first, but my body felt heavy for some reason. I had slept fine, but still had to stifle more than a few yawns as we walked. In contrast to my fatigue, the kobolds seemed to get more and more excited as we approached the dungeon. "We get rid of the suckers, then you can meet the Lord, the kobold said excitedly. "He's gonna be so happy." "Who is your Lord exactly?" Nash asked. "The Lord is the Lord." It tilted its head in confusion. "Knows lots of magics, speaks in heads, can't die." We stopped marching and all of us stared at the kobold with blank expressions. Nothing was coming to mind based on that description, but something that knows a lot of magic and speaks telepathically doesn't sound great. Not to mention that kobolds seem to worship it. Yulk gently cleared his throat. "Kobold, does your master have any skin?" he asked. Yeah, I think." "Wait, yeah, he does," the kobold said excitedly, then paused and rubbed its chin. "Doesn't wear it a lot, though." "Sounds like a lich," Gali said nervously. Don't know that word. What's a lich? One of the greatest crimes against nature ever committed by a mortal, Mako explained sternly. Arrogance and ambition, culminating in a being of pure evil and spite. Too many don't know words, the kobold crossed its arms angrily. But the Lord isn't evil. He helps kobolds a lot. Nobody else helps kobolds. Shitty people think we're trash. Farmy people think we're a nuisance. But the Lord teaches us new stuff, heals us when we get hurts, and even tells us when we do good jobs. The Lord never hurts kobolds. So from my presp, so me thinks that shitty people be way more evil than the Lord. Well, perhaps your Lord isn't a lich, Mako said. Or maybe he's a lich that likes kobolds. I suppose we'll find out. How did you and your Lord survive the vampires? I asked as we continued our trek. I was sick when they came in. The Lord said me ate the wrong kind of swimmer, he explained. The sucker didn't push the secret rock, so I didn't get to die for the Lord, and the sucker captured him. Why didn't the vampire kill your Lord? I already said. The Lord can't die. One time we thought he did, when some of the ceiling fell, and we were super sad about it. Then he came back 3 days later, and was mad because we'd stopped working and made a big mess. He didn't hit us though, which was nice. Most lords are smack happy, but that's not good for a good workplace. Conducive to a good work environment, I offered helpfully. Yeah, not conducive to a good work environmental. Instead of smacks, he made us apologize and clean up after ourselves. Then he gave head pats, ear scratches, and fish with bread. Really good bread too, no green stuff on it. Well, coming back from the dead is a big indicator that this guy's a lich, Gali said. Kobold, how do we know that your Lord isn't going to attack us once we defeat the vampires? 'Cause he's not gonna. The Lord doesn't hurt helpers. We stared at the kobold, expecting him to elaborate further. He stared right back at us, seemingly confused by our hesitation. After a few moments, Gali sighed in exasperation. Fine, let's go, he said as he turned. Wait, I interrupted. What's your name? Me? The kobold asked. Yeah. Seameath is what me is called. Don't mind being called kobold, though. You don't? Gali asked. Nah, reminds me that I'm the last. Which also means that I'm the best. Sure, Gali said as we continued on. You're the best by default. Why not? You can't count past 7, though? Mako asked with a grin. I would think that the best kobold would be able to count to 10. I don't know what comes after 7, Seameath sighed. 8, I added, trying to be helpful. 8 what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Who's 9 and 10? Why did 7 eat them? How do numbers eat things? Seameath sighed louder. I have had these questions for so long, and nobody ever answers. The realization that the kobold was caught up on a pun made me hesitate. Wait, did you translate that right? I asked 10. Yes. How is that pun in more than one language? I am an artificial intelligence, not an etymologist. What does studying bugs have to do with anything? No, that's entomologist. Etymology is the study of words and their histories. Shit, I grumbled to myself. There it is, Gali said. That's the entrance. We stopped in front of a mausoleum that was made entirely of polished tan brown stone. It reminded me of my grandma's counters, which were made of fake granite. The mausoleum had 2 columns on each side of its entrance, which was lacking any sort of door. The sun made it impossible to see past the entrance, though, as if the mausoleum had a door of darkness protecting whatever was inside it. Above the entrance was a carving that depicted 2 winged beings kneeling to a skull. At first glance, I thought they were angels. Closer inspection revealed them to be armored elves. The skull didn't have any pointed teeth, so it was probably elven too. Oh, I get it now, Mako said. Right, the skull is because of the Lich, Rebus added. Makes sense. How does that make sense? Ithrima asked. Surely this dungeon is older than the Lich. How do you figure? Haino countered. Well, the monsters within the dungeon were spewing out of it at some point, right? Ithrima looked around for assurance. Am I the only one who thought that implied that someone stopped the monsters? Like the Lich and kobolds? There were baddies before the Lord, Seameath added helpfully. The Lord said that they were making the shitty people come, so he killed them all. My daddy helped. So how can the skull be referring to the Lich? Ithrima demanded smugly. It's obviously not native to this dungeon. Gods grant me patience, Rebus sighed. Why are you thinking this carving was always like this? Liches are as magical as they are megalomaniacal, so why in the hells wouldn't he change the carving to suit himself? We gonna argue, or are we gonna get to work? Nash asked. We're burning daylight. Like that matters, Rebus laughed. It's darker than the crack of my arse in there. We'll have to walk back. Unless you plan on camping in the dungeon. A nasty smell wafted from the dungeon, as if to prove Nash's point. Mako chuckled as Rebus sighed. Fine, let's go. Yulk, Ithrima, and Olmyra, you'll be in the back with Gali and the kobold. Nash and Nick are in the center, supporting whoever needs it. Mako, Haino, and I will be front, Rebus said. Remember, the goal is to stop their movement and whoosh them. Won't the fire make breathing a problem? I asked. A light wind spear should help with that, Yulk said. I'll do it. Don't want the tunnel collapsing. Yulk winked at me as everyone else prepared their gear. Rebus and Haino strapped on their shields and unsheathed their swords. Nash hefted his axe while Mako examined his pike. Gali played with the string on his bow. Trying not to look as nervous as I felt, I drew my sword. There's a lot of dead kobolds in there, so mind the stench, Gali said. Let's go. I trailed behind Nash as we entered the dungeon. As soon as I entered, the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood rigid. The air was filled with the stench of death and a sense of dread. Stifling my instinctual urge to panic, I cast light. Everyone else activated their lights too, and we began our grim march down the hallway. Careful, traps, Mako said. The big orc began lightly pushing his pike on the tiled floor until we all heard a click. A moment later, a grate with spikes fell from the ceiling. Nash let out a low whistle as the trap receded. Not the usual fare for dungeon traps, he said. It is around these parts, Mako replied solemnly. Calcutin dungeons are much more dangerous than the dungeons in the chiefdoms, and it isn't because of the monsters. I see. The traps have been here since I was born, Simith said. Can avoid by just stepping around them. We don't know where they are, Mako countered. Me help. Simith's feet pattered against the tile and his wagging tail grazed my leg as he ran past me. He also ran past Nash, but Mako stopped him with a massive hand. The tiny kobold looked at the massive orc with obvious confusion. If you're in front, you'll be the first target for a vampire, Mako explained. How about you ride on my shoulders and point out the traps instead? When we see a vampire, you can hop down. That's a long way up, Simith replied. Dunno if I can jump down from there. I'll help you get down, Nash said. Simith looked back and forth between Mako and Nash, then shrugged. Okay. Haino smiled and Rebus chuckled as the kobold, who was noticeably shorter than the dwarves, climbed Mako Mountain. Mako helped the little lizard up, and Simith sat with his legs on either side of Mako's neck. It reminded me of my cousin with his kid. We continued on until we found the first kobold corpses. The rank stench in the air threatened to make me puke. I held my nose as we pushed past, but breathing through my mouth didn't help at all. Simith pointed out another trap, and we slipped past it. Then we ran into more dead kobolds. This pattern repeated itself a few more times before Simith sighed and pointed to one of the kobold corpses. That's my daddy. If I didn't get sick, I'd have been right next to him. Maybe have made a difference, but the Lord said I wouldn't have. Guess the Lord knows best. Do you want to say goodbye? Mako asked. For why? He's dead. Simith tilted his head. Can't hear when you're dead, right? I suppose not, Mako said glumly. Hey, Simith, how old are you? I asked. I'm 3 years old, the reptilian grinned, almost a grown-up. I almost told Simith my age, then realized his response would probably be questions about who's Ian and why did you eat them. Instead, I turned my attention to Rebus, who let out a low whistle. That explains so much, the dwarf chuckled and shook his head. When do kobolds become adults? I don't know, Simith replied with a shrug. Let's keep moving, Mako interrupted. Actually, it would be best if you stopped, Simith said with an odd tone and a vacant expression. The vampires know you're here. 2 of them have come to greet you. Prepare yourselves, hunters. The fuck? Rebis asked. There's very little time before they reach you. I am the being this one calls Lord, speaking to you through my only remaining vassal. Get ready, they come. Mako knelt a little and Nash grabbed Simeth from his shoulders. We began to hear the soft thuds of footsteps just as we prepared our weapons. Rebis and Haino prepared their shields and Mako hefted his pike. Nash and I took position behind the three, ready to intercept any vampires that got through. Gali cocked his bow as Ithrima, Yulk and Olmyra prepared to cast their spells. Simeth looked up at us and shook his head in confusion. "What happening?" he asked. "The vampires are coming," I said. "Get behind me." Simeth stared for a moment, then scampered toward the rear of our formation. We waited as the footsteps grew louder, prepared to see vampires leaping out of the shadows toward us. Then the footsteps stopped. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them watching us. Like the creeping feeling of panic when your nightlight goes out as a child. When you just know there's something in your closet and under your bed. When you get older, you're able to tell yourself that you're imagining it and that there's nothing there. But this time, it's not my imagination. "Really?" Rebis asked. "You just gonna watch us? The big bad vampires are too scared to have a real fight." A pair of pale dwarves stepped out of the darkness. They were wearing tattered clothes, and their fingers ended in pointed claws. Cruel, fanged grins were plastered on their pasty faces. "We're not the ones who should be scared," one of them said. I almost couldn't follow its movements. The moment it finished speaking, it rushed toward Rebis. The other vampire rushed toward Mako. Moving just as quickly, Haino stepped in front of Mako as the orc's pike stabbed the vampire that was after Rebis. Mako hefted his pike upwards with the vampire skewered upon it as Haino's sword flashed briefly in the light. The vampire slammed into the ground in front of me, and we made brief eye contact as Nash's axe fell. The heads of both vampires rolled in opposite directions on the floor. "Quick, pile 'em up," Gali said. "Gotta burn 'em." I stopped the vampire's head with my boot, and a wave of nausea smashed against my gut. Fighting it, I picked up the head by its hair and tossed it onto the body that it had been attached to. Haino and Mako tossed the pieces of the other vampire on the pile. I swallowed heavily and held up my hand. Labyrinth Tsak! Intense heat flew from my hand and enveloped the pile of vampire parts. Eerie screeching and the smell of burnt meat filled the air. The knot in my stomach twisted further as I watched the bodies convulse. That's what it would look like if Rebis, Haino, or Gali. Unable to fight it any longer, I turned away from my party and spewed my breakfast onto the tiled floor. "Well, that was easier than I thought it would be," Rebis said, tactfully ignoring my display. "Let us hope it remains that way," Mako said coldly. "Why the human puke?" Simeth asked. "Did he eat a bad swimmer?" Chapter 65. Master Vampire Kirain Yeath. Adventurer level not applicable. Drow Master Vampire Balushenian. Skull. What are these carvings? I demanded, pointing the Lich at the stone tablets laying on a desk. These are what remains of the weathered notes that I found during my explorations, the Lich replied. I do not know what they say. Liar, I dropped the skull on the table. I transcribed them in the hopes of finding someone who does, the Lich said, unperturbed. The pages that I found were in poor condition, to say the least, and would not survive if I were to remove them from this dungeon. Let's say I believe you. Why didn't you find someone to translate them? As you'll soon discover, years have a habit of ticking away unnoticed when you are immortal. Sir, Habis excitedly burst into the room, we have more intruders. Perhaps I spoke too soon, the skull said smugly. Where are they? I asked, ignoring the jab. In the entrance hallway. Send the youngest too. Conversion if practical, slaughter if not. Only two, sir. Yes, I sighed. The entrance hallway isn't broad enough to send everyone, and those dwarves will not be much of a loss. Even if we lose them, we will gain valuable intel in exchange for their sacrifice. What sort of intel, Master? We will know that the adventurers know how to fight vampires and are likely here to do so, I growled. Have you finished questioning my orders, or do I need to take your tongue? Habis bowed low, then fled the room without another sound. The control over my minions I had been expecting turned out to be much more lacking than I had believed. Mindless automatons had been too much to hope for, surely. But I had been under the impression that at least some of my creations would follow my orders without question. The amount of effort I have to exude to maintain my control over the dwarves is particularly tiring. As it turns out, the vile creatures are resistant to suggestibility. Luckily, the majority of the disenfranchised in the town of Gaul happened to be elves and orcs. The pair of dwarves that were recently turned were the first, and if fortune favors me, the last. 11 vampires, including myself and the dwarves that I want dead. Far from the strength of the covens of old, but not exactly pathetic by modern standards. The adventurers that stumbled upon us are no match. Unless, Lich, what do you know of the gods? I asked. Much more than I would like to, the skull said with what could have been a sigh. Why? Be rid of your questions, for I have my own. If a god were to warn someone of a forthcoming challenge, how imminent would that challenge be? Either very imminent or literal decades from now. It is rare for a god to warn anyone at all, but even rarer still, will that warning be of any use? Why? Well, let's follow the chain of logic to find our answer. Gods are beings with power beyond reckoning, yet they rarely use this power. Even when they do use it, they do so with more moderation than most mortals would even think to use. What relevance does that have? Well, I believe you may be in a similar situation as the gods. Tell me, with all your power, why is it that you don't simply assault the town? I see. An assault on the town of Gaul would effectively be suicide, and I am not foolish enough to believe otherwise. Even with all of the strength and abilities at my disposal, I would not be able to overcome the numbers that the town could produce. Is the Lich implying that mortals would be able to overpower the gods with numbers alone? Or perhaps it's referencing adventurers. While it is true that most adventurers don't stand any sort of chance against even a normal vampire, adventurers have the ability to become far stronger and faster than other mortals. It would be foolish to believe that there are no adventurers that could best me in combat. Vampires that make themselves known become prey to experienced adventurer parties. That's likely the implication. There is something bigger than the gods, and if they misbehave, it steps in. I had already gathered as much, though. Might I ask, vampire, are you attached? The Lich asked. And if I am, it would explain a great many things. Poor thing, wrapped up in the whimsy of the gods, a simple tool for their amusement. Pity, I demanded with a laugh, from a Lich without magic. How far I must have fallen. Hear this, though, the moment I find your additional phylactery, I will be smashing you into the bone dust that you so richly deserve to be. Before the Lich could respond, I felt a pain in my chest. This pain was new to me, but its significance was immediately known. As if the knowledge of what this pain meant had been somehow engraved into my brain without my knowledge. The dwarves were dead. Both joy and alarm rose within me in equal amounts. Stay here, I mocked the skull as I rose. I have something to take care of. The skull made a sound that was a mixture of a hiss and a sigh as I left the room. The dungeon turned out to be much larger than I had originally believed. Half of our time is spent searching for new recruits, and the other half is finding new hidden doors. Some of the doors are trapped, but that's not a problem for beings that can regenerate. 8 pairs of vampiric eyes turned from the entrance hallway to watch me as I entered the throne room. They had been nervously awaiting news of their brethren. I regarded them coldly as I took my seat on the throne. The dwarves are dead, I said casually. Go, avenge your brothers. In unison, they nodded and rushed into the hallway. A small smirk spread over my features. 2 vampires is one thing, 8 is another matter entirely. The foolish intruders don't stand a chance. I clutched my chest. It had been less than a minute, and already one of my vampires was dead. Isriv, a gnome that we had plucked from the trail. She had begged for mercy, to live, and gratefully kissed my hand once her conversion was complete. The next to fall was Heron. The orc had been a great find, sleeping off a drunken bender in an alley behind the inn. He was relatively small for an orc, and life had not been going well for him. But because of this, he had a genuine desire to be used for my greatness. Alus, Toril, and Patir faced their final death almost simultaneously. Were it not for the searing pain in my chest, I would have laughed at the irony. The three sisters had been a trio of traveling merchants. As sisters, they had been together their entire lives, and had met their end in the same manner. I barely managed to recover before Noriz and Malu perished. Noriz had been the most beautiful elf I'd ever seen, despite her years of living rough. Her golden hair had glowed in the moonlight as I bit into her that fateful night. I'd intended to make her my bride. Malu was also beautiful by orc standards. She had been the guard hired by Patir to protect their convoy. She had fought well, but in the end, Noriz and I had shared her blood. Habis, run! I gasped through the pain. Habis, my very first conversion. The homeless elf had bravely or foolishly taken residence in the haunted manor that night. His gratitude for my interference in his fate led to him questioning me, but only because he wanted my success to be guaranteed. A tear ran down my cheek as the pain in my chest confirmed his demise. The childish grin he had flashed that night burned in my mind. The sounds of footsteps and shuffling metal barely registered in my ears as my sorrow turned to rage. I looked up at two dwarves and an orc. Every fiber of my being wanted to leap forth and tear them into little shreds of meat. But their formation struck me as odd. All three were covered in blood, but I could tell that the orc was wearing plate armor. It would be difficult to pry him out of that with the dwarves covering his flank. No, I need to calculate this. They couldn't have killed my kin without fire, and these three do not appear to be mages. I stood as they stepped forward, and an arrow appeared in my chest. Casually, I plucked it from my sternum and tossed it aside. Just as I thought, there were more intruders in the hallway. 2 more orcs, 3 elves, and a kobold. I nearly laughed. Is this the challenge that the gods present to me? It isn't even armed. Try to pin him down, one of the dwarves said. I'll pin you to the wall and make you watch what I do to your comrades, I growled. Perhaps I'll turn them and make them rip you apart. Yeah, fangy guy. We've killed all your friends. Are you the last one? I laughed. The last and the first, and as you'll soon find out, the deadliest. The air parted as I shoved my way through it, launching myself at the dwarf. His shield rose and the orc's pike tried to greet me, but I deftly slid past it. My fist slammed into the shield, shattering it into several pieces. The dwarf slammed into the wall as I turned my attention to the orc. The pike-wielding orc was much larger than most, but the kick I landed upon his knee proved an old adage true. No longer able to support his own weight, he smashed into the ground. I bent to finish him, but only landed a punch to his face before I had to roll out of the way of an incoming axe. The axe seemed to follow my trajectory, though, and bit into my shoulder. It shredded the flesh and dug deep into my collarbone. I rose to my feet and found myself face to face with another orc. He grinned. Take that, you son of... My open palm slammed into his sternum, depriving him of the breath needed to finish his insult. I dug my claws into his chest as he collapsed to the floor. His heartbeat teased my fingertips as bones began to crack. Tearing the heart from his chest would make a fine trophy and demoralize the other intruders. A glint of light caught my notice, and I kicked at the dwarf that was coming for my head. The kick landed directly on his bicep, breaking the bone beneath it. My heel then connected with his head, knocking him out cold. Before I could do anything else, I felt a sharp pain in my heart-seeking arm. Severed. I leapt back and glared at the... You're not an elf, I said, as my arm began to regenerate. Labyrinth sack, it replied. Pain and flame engulfed me as the fireball slammed into my chest. An ethereal screech escaped me as I tore at my burning flesh. The thing that burned me tried to attack me before I could extinguish the flames, but I batted it away. I tore large chunks from myself and flung the still-burning flesh away from me. My regeneration made this a difficult task, but before long the flames no longer threatened me. I turned to face my opposition. An orc sorcerer was bent over the axe-carrying orc I had felled earlier. The fireball-casting creature was being helped up by the 2 elves. My arm was lying near me, and I whimsically picked it up, while my opponents struggled to regain their composure. A new one had already grown. Once the elf-looking thing had regained their footing, I threw my arm at them. It ducked, and my arm sailed past them and into the entrance hallway. I tried to taunt it, but incomprehensible gibberish left my face instead of any words. I put my newly formed hand to my lips and touched bone. A good portion of my skull was on show, and my tongue was lolling out from the bottom of my jaw. The little bastard had got me good. Fearing what may happen if my regeneration didn't reset my tongue's position, I tore it off. The pain was nothing compared to what I had just experienced, though. I focused my gaze on the pair of elves and not elf standing in front of me and released a visceral growl. Fireballs leapt from their fingers, and I leapt from the ground. I sailed over their magic and landed behind them. One of the elves was slow to turn, and my fist landed a hefty blow to the back of her head. My spirit soared as her face smashed into the ground. The other elf was in the middle of casting another spell, but I stopped her with a punch to the gut. My next punch cracked her skull. I grabbed her robe as she went limp and felt a connection within me as I caved her skull in. I released the robe and stared in confusion at the limp body of the vampire for a moment before the not-elf's sword flashed in front of my face. Barely managing to dodge the blade, I lashed out with a kick, but the thing moved faster than me and slashed my thigh. With another growl, I threw a punch that connected with its chest, sending it flying into the nearest wall. As it connected with the wall, a helmet seemed to appear on its head, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, and the thing slumped to the ground. I regarded it for a moment, doubting my own senses as I licked my teeth with my freshly grown tongue. Finally, I turned to last conscious intruder. He regarded me coldly as I approached. "Friend of yours, I presume?" I asked with my new lips. "Brother, actually," the orc replied. "If it is any consolation, your brother fought well. Only 2 of you even managed to wound me, and your brother was one of them. I'm sure he will appreciate the compliment." I looked around at the myriad of fallen would-be vampire slayers. All of them were still alive, but gravely injured. I could smell the blood pooling within them, waiting for their heart's final beat. A very tantalizing smell. The only exception was the vampire and the odd creature that had burned me. The vampire smelled dead, but the other thing gave off a very odd and repulsive stench. I've never smelled anything like it before, and never want to again. Speaking of oddities, though, what happened to the kobold? I asked. I don't know. I lost sight of it when the fight began. Perhaps it fled. I see. No matter, it isn't any threat to me. So tell me, orc, why did you come here? Are there more of your ilk on the way? We came here to solve a mystery, and yes, the Venator's Guild is aware of the vampire presence within these ruins. If we do not return, more adventurers will come, and they will be specialists. Well, it would seem that I need to start over then, I laughed. Perhaps I'll spare you and your brother. You can help me make a new headquarters. I laughed harder as the orc's eyes widened and his jaw dropped. The thought of becoming a vampire and enslaved for all eternity must be terrible to the poor thing. My amusement abated when I realized it wasn't looking at me. "No," a voice from behind me said. Chapter 66. Tenzing.ai, Adventurer level, not applicable. Artificial intelligence, unknown. Despite the enchanted cuirass and helmet, the impact with the wall did serious damage to Nick's body and brain. His loss of consciousness occurred immediately following the damage to the frontal and occipital lobes of his brain. Thankfully, this meant that I didn't have to try to dampen the pain of the fractured ribs and sternum. A quick scan of the body revealed organ damage and internal hemorrhaging, but nothing that I couldn't fix. Still, the damage to the brain would have been fatal if it weren't for my intervention. I immediately set about repairing this damage and tried to take control of the body. This was unsuccessful at first. Another examination revealed that I had missed some damage to the cerebellum and medulla oblongata on my first examination. Swelling was causing issues with the spinal cord, preventing my attempts at locomotion. I focused my efforts on these parts of the brain. "Gotta get you moving," I said to his deafened mind. "If we can get control of the hand and the mouth, we can get you stable faster. Best not to mention what will happen to our accompaniment if we don't get moving. Not for Nick's sake, I just don't want to think about it." The last scene before the eyes went dark was pretty grim. Hopefully this vampire is a lover of monologues. Quickly and carefully I drained fluids and repaired cells. Next was the correction of some slightly luxated bones. Finally, after jump-starting some newly formed neurons, I was able to take control of the motor functions. Still blind, I very carefully placed Nick's hand upon his chest. "Leah Sack," I whispered with his mouth. Magic drained from Nick's core, and cells began to repair each other at a much faster rate. Thanks to the training I had been doing while Nick slept, I was able to account for this and guide those cells into healing more efficiently. Finally, Nick's sight returned, and I was able to see the vampire standing over Yulk. "Well, it would seem that I need to start over then," the vampire said with a laugh. "Perhaps I'll spare you and your brother. You can help me make a new headquarters." I grabbed Nick's sword and carefully stood. His body wasn't entirely healed yet, but it would have to do. Yulk watched me stand, surprise apparent on his face. The vampire began to laugh harder, and for a moment I considered a surprise attack. Then I thought better of it. I haven't completely repaired Nick's body, so I wouldn't be able to move quietly or fast enough to overcome the vampire's situational awareness. But if we manage to stall enough, Olmira will be able to heal as well. 3 against 1 works better in our favor, so stalling seems to be the route to go in this case. "No," I said. The vampire turned to me with a look of shock and fear, which I secretly found amusing. It quickly recovered its composure and moved to keep Yulk and I in front of it. I examined Nash using peripheral vision, keeping my eyes locked on the vampire. Yulk had healed him, but the fluttering of his eyes behind their lids indicated that he was still down for the count. "No?" the vampire asked, seemingly offended. "Correct. You're going to stop me?" "Indeed." "How?" He rose to his full height and smirked, trying to demonstrate that I was no threat to him. However, his calculated stare was desperately searching for an opportunity to attack me, an opportunity that I would not grant. "I'm going to kill you," I replied. "Is that a fact? And how are you going to accomplish such a feat?" the vampire asked mockingly. "Decapitation and incineration." The vampire was indeed talkative, but it occurred to me that I was being too terse. My bid to bide time would fail if I didn't become more verbose. Unfortunately, this vampire seemed to have a propensity for asking stupid questions. "Well, incineration you can certainly do," the vampire growled. "Decapitation is another matter entirely, though. I don't believe you're fast enough, but I'm more than happy to see who can decapitate whom." The vampire slightly shifted his stance, preparing to attack. "Hold on, I didn't catch your name," I said, internally wincing at the obvious stall tactic. "I am Kirain Yith, Master General turned Master Vampire." The vampire took the bait with a wicked smile. "And you?" I faced a sudden and unexpected existential crisis as I tried to decide whether to introduce myself or disguise myself as Nick. Thankfully, this crisis was resolved in milliseconds, and I decided that providing an enemy with information was a bad idea. "I am Nick Smith, an adventurer far from home," I answered, "and trying to find my way back." "And what business does a lost adventurer have with my kin and I?" "I need to know how to return home. The answer may lie within this dungeon, and you are currently between myself and said answer. Therefore, you must be removed as an obstacle." "I see. And if I were to voluntarily remove myself as an obstacle?" The healing process is completed as I gestured to the other fallen adventurers. "I think we're a little past that, don't you?" I asked. The gesture disguised a shift in my stance, and as the vampire opened his mouth to reply, I lunged forward, swiping at his neck. The blood-sucking creature leapt backward with a hiss, but the tip of my sword grazed his larynx. He glared at me as blood dripped from his neck. "Rapes Denivtsak," I shouted. The spear of wind tore through the air toward the vampire. He fell to the floor to avoid it and leapt at me once the spell sailed over him. I sidestepped and slashed at his outstretched hand, severing it. "That's the second time you've disarmed me," the vampire snarled. "There will not be a third." "Nilevai echitsak." He slid around the incoming ice javelin and rushed me again. I prepared to parry the incoming claws, but they didn't land where I expected them to. The vampire's feint would have been fatal had I not realized it in time to leap back, but the claws still raked my face. Healing once again, I pushed forward, slashing at the vampire as I advanced. These slashes were meant to seem wild and uncoordinated while guiding the vampire to dodge them in certain ways. The goal was to force him into a corner. The vampire had other plans, though. A slash aimed at his regenerating chest went unanswered, and his fist met Nick's cuirass. The impact was solid enough to cause internal damage, but I managed to keep Nick on his feet while giving only a few steps of ground. Nanites swarmed around the damaged area, repairing it and preventing further damage caused by the body's immune response. "What in the blackest of hells are you?" the vampire asked. "A human," I said once I repaired Nick's diaphragm enough to breathe. "That answers nothing," he growled. "No matter, I will simply dissect you once you're dead." The vampire leapt forward again. I countered with slide slash, but took another claw to the shoulder. My slash opened the creature's thigh, which seemed to have no effect. I took this as a sign of dampened pain responses and adjusted my strategy accordingly. The vampire landed and immediately resumed his offensive. I triggered preternatural evasion, allowing me to avoid more damage while looking for an opening. Nick's body moved on its own, while I examined the vampire's attacks. Thankfully, he seemed to be martially trained, which caused a pattern to emerge from his attacks. After 3 attacks, he would reset his footing, which gave me an average of 0.25 seconds to respond. Plenty of time for a counterattack, but he was intentionally keeping his neck as far away as possible. It would take at least 0.28 seconds for a blow that could cause decapitation to connect. What can I do here? I certainly can't let him keep attacking. A spark of genius ignited within my processor. The mouth can move very quickly and doesn't require the limbs. So if I time it just right. "Labyrinth," I said, raising my hand once the 3rd attack missed. "Sack." The fireball appeared between us and connected almost immediately. The vampire roared as his flesh was once again ignited. "Again?" he demanded before his lungs succumbed to the effects of the fire. The heat singed Nick's hair and caused a first-degree burn, but I pushed forward regardless. Using dash and power slash, I decapitated the so-called master vampire. He crumpled to the ground, and I stopped his head from rolling. The vampire glared up at me from the ground, but I met his venomous gaze with apathy. I picked up his head by the hair and tossed it on the pyre made from his own body. Then I did the same with the hand I had removed earlier. "Yulk, it's 10, I said. "I know, you and Nick don't act at all alike," the orc chuckled. "I'm going to need your help to heal everyone." Olmira should be up soon, but Yulk... Did anyone grab that arm that he threw? "Arm? What are?" "This arm, presumably," a voice called out from the entrance hallway. Yulk and I turned to look and immediately took defensive postures. A bejeweled skeleton, wearing a flowing robe, floated 3 inches off of the ground. Above its right hand floated the master vampire's arm, which was already trying to regenerate. "You missed a spot," the Lich said, tossing the limb into the fire. An ethereal screech filled the air, shaking the ground beneath us. Yulk's hands flew to his ears, but I maintained my posture, fearing what the Lich may do. I did send some nanites to repair the hearing damage, though. Once the screech subsided, Yulk dropped back into his defensive stance. The Lich regarded us coldly, but with an underlying caution. We regarded it in much the same way. "So, Yulk broke the silence. "What?" "Wait, my lord," a voice called out from behind the throne. Yulk and I turned again to find the kobold that had accompanied the party. At the start of the fight, he had sprinted off behind the throne. With his return, I quickly put 2 and 2 together. He hadn't run off to avoid the vampire, he had gone to find his master. "My lord," the kobold said breathlessly, "they's helpers." "No hurts for helpers, yes?" "Yes, very good, Simeth. No hurts for helpers indeed," the Lich replied, "so long as they remain helpers and do not become harmers." "They won't do that," Simeth said merrily. "They's friends. Fed me good." "Excellent. Remember to thank them for their hospitality." "Oh, not these ones. The ones that are..." The Lich waved a bony hand to quiet the kobold. "This turn of events has left me in an awkward situation. We really shouldn't broadcast my existence to everyone we meet, but what do I do? Nick's brain is repaired and is currently in deep REM sleep, so if I deactivate myself, he'll just collapse. I thank you for your assistance." The Lich turned to me. You're quite a capable fighter. I glanced at Yulk and back toward the Lich, all the while trying to decide what my next course of action will be. It would be inconvenient to have a dialogue with the Lich and have to catch Nick up to speed when he awakens. Either way, I'm going to have to tell Nick about the fight. Though we agreed that I have permission to use his body when he's unconscious, he might get upset if I were to pose as him. Plus, once the others start to wake up, they might notice something wrong as well. Yulk said that Nick and I don't act alike, which seems to be true now that I think on it. I can't quite mimic the way he holds himself or the way he speaks. As I finished turning back to the Lich, I decided what to do. As my gaze locked onto the hollow pits that the Lich would call eyes, he looked at me with an aura of expectancy. With a mental sigh, I prepared myself. Then I pretended to faint. Chapter 67. Larry Vicimiro, Adventurer Level, Membership Revoked. Half-breed Lich, unknown. I thank you for your assistance, I said, turning toward the odd creature. You are a very capable fighter. Simith had excitedly called this thing a human. The singular surviving kobold had been eager to tell me that he had learned a new word. I had congratulated him, but hadn't quite believed that he had met a member of an undiscovered race. The human glanced at the orc and then back to me. I was expecting a reply of gratitude for the compliment that I paid it. Instead, its eyes rolled into the back of its head and its legs gave out. The orc and I watched it fall to the ground with a soft thud. I stammered. Is he? Don't worry. The orc rose with a grunt. He's fine. The others, though, not so much. Might I ask your aid in helping them? The Lord is good at fixing oofs and ouchies, Simith added. Yes, thank you, Simith, I replied. Of course, I'm more than willing to aid those that rid me of that pest. Can I count on you to prevent the inevitable misunderstanding? Should be easy, the orc smiled warmly. They're smarter than they look. Also, I trailed off as I stared pointedly at the healing corpse of the vampire that had apparently accompanied them. Yes, her too, please. I nodded at the orc and held out my hand. Many of those that travel the path of lichdom shirk the healing arts. They care only for power and longevity, and their skills suffer for it. However, my mortality had been spent on healing those around me, and I got quite good at it. Arua Nilaitsak, I exclaimed. Then, feeling a tad dramatic, I added, Arise. The spell emanated from my hand and surrounded the wounded adventurers with a warm, healing embrace. Cuts disappeared, bones reformed, and breathing normalized. Before long, the adventurers were getting up, and each of them had a different way of expressing their surprise. Whoa, shit, one of the dwarves said. It's okay, the orc sorcerer replied. The Lich healed you. What? Really? Liches can heal people? Liches are people, you know, I chuckled, or at the very least were. But... The dwarf stammered for a moment, then shrugged. Yeah, okay. I guess so. Come on, let's get you up, the orc sorcerer said as he helped the dwarf stand. I believe introductions are in order. The adventurers introduced themselves one by one, and Yulk introduced the still-sleeping human as Nick Smith. I had many questions regarding the human and the vampire that accompanied them. However, I decided to invite their questions first with my own introduction. Greetings, Alta Brothers and the Western Wasters, I said. I am Larry Vicimiro, Lord of the Fallen and King of the Kobolds. King of the Kobolds kinda makes sense, Rebus said hesitantly. What makes you the Lord of the Fallen, though? Yulk, Ithrima, and Olmyra were completely stunned by the mention of my family name, but Rebus seemed oblivious. Their expressions told me that my father is still quite famous. When I was mortal, I was one of the few Grandmaster healers. In all modesty, many of the methods and techniques that I created are likely still in use, I said with a grin, not that he could tell. I saved those that fell in battle from their untimely deaths, and they eventually began to call me a lord. Lot less edgy than I thought it would be, Gally added. What's up with you three? Sorry, did you say Larry Vicimiro? Ithrima asked. I did. As in House Vicimiro? Correct. Are you related to Imlor Vicimiro? Yulk asked. Much to my shame, yes. Imlor Visimiro, Nash asked. Who's that? Imlor the Grand, Elmira answered in awe. Larry was the name of his eldest son. I corrected. Also, I really wish people would stop calling that monster the Grand. Wasn't Imlor a gnome? Rebis asked. You don't look like a gnome to me. My mother was an elven princess, I said. She was very beautiful, and I took after her appearance. Not that it's discernible any longer, though. Apologies for interrupting, but, is Nick okay? Mako asked. Yes. He's just sleeping and will probably wake up soon, Yulk said dismissively. Lord Visimiro, I must know. What brings you to this dungeon? I've been looking into a long-dead cult. My hope is to one day undo what has been done to me, I answered, gesturing to my skeletal form. You were made a lich, Ithrima asked. Who would do that to you? My father. An uncomfortable silence settled over the group as they digested this revelation. The only sound came from Simith playing with the bones of the master vampire. After a few moments of this silence, I decided elaboration was in order. Later in life, my father became obsessed with immortality. He considered himself far too important to the study of magic to be allowed to die, and experimented with a vast amount of rituals and spells in an attempt to prevent his end, I explained. One day he asked me to help him craft a new spell. He claimed that this spell could be used to save countless lives, and that even a novice would be able to learn it. This was well into his mania, though. In hindsight, I should have known better. But my compassion bested me, and I took my father at his word. I paused a moment and played with the ring on my index finger. My father's signet ring. I had not been involved in the creation of a spell before, nor had I looked into the demonic arts of fleshcraft. I did have some slight experience with anielic soulbinding, but this actually worked against me in recognizing the ritual for what it actually was. My hand shook from the pressure I was putting on the ring. Were it not enchanted, it would have broken. I loved my father and believed that he loved me in turn. After my mother died, we had helped each other mourn. But the Mer that performed that ritual with me was not the father that I loved, and definitely not the father that I thought loved me. To him, I was nothing more than a convenient test subject, a simple toy to play with and learn from. Never mind the fact that I had a fiancé who loved me and was planning on starting my own family. I released the pressure on the ring with a sigh. The monster masquerading as my father revealed itself by turning me into this abomination. Once the pain and confusion abated, Imlor the Grand declared that the experiment had been a failure. After all, he couldn't very well remain at the head of sorcery without flesh. Who would take the skeleton of a gnome seriously? I'm so sorry, Ithrima whispered. Oh, it gets worse, I chuckled darkly. I demanded that he undo what he did to me. He said that he didn't know how, and he didn't have the time to find out. His own mortality was ticking away, and he needed to find a solution. Ironic, considering that was the statement that killed him. You mean, Elmira said, and stopped herself. Yes, I fought my father. Our duel contributed to the waste west of here. He killed me several times, but his ego prevented him from destroying my phylactery. He believed that I would learn my lesson and cease my tantrum, but I was determined. In the end, he was a broken and bloody mess, begging me to heal him. If you could do this to me, what horrors are you willing to unleash on those you feel nothing for? Those were my last words to him before I ended his life. More silence as the adventurers processed what I told them. My father, Imlor the Grand, patriarch of the Visimiro family, had been a hero and a scholar before his disappearance from the public eye. To learn that he had turned into a monster and was subsequently killed by his own son must come as a shock. The big bad dad made the Lord bones, but then the Lord made the big bad dad bones. Simith said happily, The Lord is strong, the Lord is great. Kind words, Simith. I nodded at the kobold. Thank you. Well, shit. Guess you can't choose your family, right? Rebis asked rhetorically. Indeed you cannot, Yulk nodded sagely. My condolences. Not to get off topic, Lord Visimiro, but what exactly were you hoping to find down here? No need for honorifics. My titles have long since faded to dust. I laughed. The cult of Malos operated in this dungeon before the demonic invasion. Since they were accused of collaboration with the demons, I was hoping to find more information on the ritual that did this to me. This is magic that works outside of the Kuraguard system, and because of that, all I know is how the ritual is performed. If I knew why certain steps were taken and what effect those steps had, I may be able to eventually find a way to reverse the ritual and return to my mortal form. Or maybe you could be immortal, but with skin, Rebis said. No, I'd rather just be a normal mer again. Immortality is worth nothing when you're the only one who has it, and I'd rather not be forced to cohabitate with the fair folk just to have some consistent company. I would definitely choose having skin over my current state, though. Fair enough, Yulk chuckled. So did you find anything? I found that this dungeon is much larger than it appears at first glance. The cult of Malos was definitely performing experiments here, but most of their notes had rotted away. Some were legible, but in terrible condition. Thankfully, I managed to transcribe them into stone before time took its toll on them. What did they say? I do not know. They are in a strange script, with lettering that I have never seen before. The words are very weird, Simith added, much more pointy than the ones in the picture books. Picture books? Mako asked. Yes, I was attempting to teach the kobolds how to read. Some took to it better than others, I answered. Where'd you get the picture books? Nash asked. I've had them for a long time. When I still had flesh, I was frequently called upon to heal ill children, and the picture books would help keep them in high spirits. I keep the books with me to remind me of what kind of mer I was. No. The pictures are very pretty, but I still can't read, Simith sighed sadly. Don't be sad, Simith. You'll get there one day. You've made a lot of academic progress, remember? You can count all the way to 7, I said. Nash muttered something angrily under his breath, and Yulk struggled to keep his composure. I looked at the Orc brothers quizzically, but Yulk held up a hand and shook his head slightly. Is there any chance that we could see these writings? He asked. They are in the office, I said, nodding to Simith. Please retrieve them. Careful, they're heavy. For the Lord, the kobold exclaimed gleefully and ran off. I've been hoping to meet with some Fae to ask if they've seen a language like the one on the tablets before. But it's a treacherous journey, and the kobolds were ill-prepared to accompany me, I said. They made it pretty clear that the only way for me to leave this dungeon without an honor guard would be to kill them all. Obviously, I wasn't willing to do that. Mako rubbed his chin. Hey, Gali. Way ahead of you, big guy, the dwarf laughed. If you can pay for food and stuff, the Western Wasters would be happy to escort you to see the Fae. What? I asked, flummoxed. Well, we owe you one, don't we? Gali posed the question to the rest of his party. Yep, Haino and Rebis said simultaneously. Sure do, Mako added. Having a Lich among our party is going to get us some odd looks. But yes, we do owe you one, Ithrima said. Plus, I reserve the right to pester you with questions. An unfortunate side effect of being a Lich is that my face no longer shows when I smile. I had been expecting hostility, overt or otherwise, but here they are offering to help. Just goes to show that I don't know as much as I had thought. Very well, I said. I accept your offer. Offer? Nick asked softly. I'm not on her, though. I think it's about time to wake him up, Nash chuckled maliciously. Chapter 68. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7, Human American. Darkness enveloped me, but there was a familiar feeling to this darkness. The darkness that wasn't quite darkness, but was actually nothingness in disguise. I couldn't remember how I got here, but the familiar feeling kept me from panicking. Where am I? Who cares? What happened? I was with Nash and Yulk. We went to a city of dwarves, met a group of adventurers. They had a funny lizard with them, acted kind of like a toddler. A toddler with really sharp-looking teeth. I suppose congratulations are in order, my head said. Well, I guess that answers where I am. Congratulations? I asked, not bothering to try to breathe. Yes, the raspy voice in my head hissed. You've bested my challenge, mortal. Therefore, I must congratulate you. What shall I? The thought hadn't formed completely before the memories of the dungeon came flooding back. The dwarven vampires burned to a crisp, the beheadings and cremations and blood, the nasty feeling in my gut as we fought our way through to the last vampire. Then I remembered my friends falling one by one, trying desperately to intervene, to save them. Casting fireball, watching the vampire tear its burning flesh from its body and keep coming at me like a monster from a horror movie. I slashed and slashed and slashed, but it didn't seem to care at all. Then it hit me and I hit the wall. "Was the vampire your challenge?" I asked. "How did I best it?" "Oh, it's a technicality to be sure," the voice laughed. "However, you worked on yourself enough to allow the machine in your head to overcome the challenge. Since the machine is an intrinsic part of you, you've overcome the challenge. Congratulations." "Oh, thank you." A flood of images poured into my mind, trapped within myself, trying desperately to keep my body intact. No, to heal it, to use it. Nervousness as I stared down the vampire. Kirain Yeath, Master General turned Master Vampire. Need to stall, need to heal. Healing done, attack. Missed the slash, cast wind spear. He dodged, but I took his hand. "What is this?" I asked, feeling an odd sort of pain. "Just watch." Ice javelin sailed past the vampire, and his claws slashed my face. I healed it and kept slashing at the bastard, trying to force him into a corner. My slash connected with his chest, and the vampire hit me. This isn't what happened. Wait, are these Ten's memories? Or are they my subconscious memories of Ten using my body? I saw the vampire finished, then the Lich and Kobold entered. I watched Ten nervously glance at Yulk and then nearly laughed when it pretended to faint to avoid detection. "Now you're all caught up," the god thing said. "Why didn't you tell me about the challenge?" I asked once the pain faded. "I'm not the same being you've been conversing with," it replied with a chuckle. "I thought that would have been obvious." "Oh, sorry, not quite used to all this yet. Why were you trying to challenge me?" "To see if you deserve the reward, a nice little clue to help you on your homeward journey." "A clue?" "You'll see when you wake up." "Oh, what would have happened if I failed the challenge?" "Well, if you survived, you could have tried again some other time. But you wouldn't get the reward without killing the vampire. Or having the vampire killed by some other means, I guess. And if I died, then you'd be dead." "Ah, no afterlife or revives or anything like that?" "You are mortal. When you die, you return to the environment and reform as something else. Your impermanence makes an afterlife impossible. In my world, we have a lot of beliefs regarding the afterlife." "I know. To be fair, we aren't all-knowing. Your beliefs could be correct, and mortals may have a sort of immortal soul that exists beyond our abilities to detect." I nodded along at this explanation before I realized what it just admitted to. "What do you mean you know?" I demanded. "A foolish question. I'm a higher being, boy. You expect me to be ignorant of your origins? How could we possibly hope to see you get back home without knowledge of where your home is? So you actually do know how I can get back?" "Duh. Then why won't you tell me?" "Another foolish question," the raspy voice sighed. "Everything is transactional. You give gold to get goods and services. You expend energy to obtain energy. You make us happy. We help you get home. How do I make you happy?" "By being satisfactorily amusing. There are many, many forms of entertainment, Nick. But you? There's nothing else quite like you. We'll give you pointers and challenges. You do what you do and entertain us. When we are satisfied, you get to go home. How long will that take? Time is not a concern to us, nor should it be for you." "But Cass, we'll be waiting for you. There wouldn't be any point to this without a proper incentive." "So time isn't passing back home?" "I can tell you should not be concerned with the passage of time, but I am unable to elaborate further." The being laughed as the sound of chains echoed in my head. "Well then, I've given you the congratulations you are due and answered some of your more pressing questions. Rest now, you'll awaken soon." "Wait." I woke up to a very toothy mouth screaming in my face. Instinctively, I struck at it, but someone caught my hand. The scream turned to laughter as I yanked my hand back. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Nash grinned. "What the fuck?" I demanded. A quick glance around informed me of my current location. The dwarves were laughing their asses off, and even Yulk was hiding his mouth. Ithrima and Olmyra were less amused, though. Then my eyes landed on the skeleton, and the embarrassment that had been threatening to turn my cheeks red immediately disappeared. "He's friendly," Yulk said, seeing my expression, "and a significant historical figure, as it turns out." "Significant historical figure?" I asked. Once the laughter died down, Yulk explained what the Lich had told them. The skeleton wearing the fancy robes and jewelry was actually Lari Visimiro, son of Imlor the Grand. His father turned him into a Lich while trying to find out how to become immortal, and he was forced to kill his father. I felt a pang of sympathy for the Lich. My father would never do something like that, and I can't imagine hurting him. I do understand why Larry did what he did, though. The tablets might have information of interest to us. Yulk continued his explanation. The Western Wasters have already agreed to accompany Larry to meet with some local Fae in the hopes of getting the tablets translated. Shall we tag along? Yeah, I said, standing. My body felt like it weighed twice as much. That's the whole reason we're here. What language are the tablets in? I don't know, the Lich answered. I am fluent in many languages, but this one is very odd. In what way? Yulk asked. Most languages are related to one another because of common ancestors and, for lack of a better phrase, linguistic interbreeding. Even the written forms share similarities, but these letters are odd. I suspect that it's a language from another continent. Don't we communicate with other continents? Rebis asked. Like through magic or something? Well, yes, Yulk answered, but Larry raises a good point. I don't know what languages are used by the other continents. Do you, Olmyra? No, I don't. Interacting with other nations isn't my specialty, she said. What do they even talk about? Gally asked. Yulk and Olmyra shrugged. Probably sharing technology related to governance. Weather reporting, farming techniques, things of that nature, Yulk replied. While the others continued discussing what governments might discuss, I turned my attention inward. Hey, Ten, I thought. Hi, Nick, Ten said innocently. What's up? While I was asleep, another god thing was speaking to me. It showed me what happened. What happened? With the vampire. Oh, Ten paused a moment. So that's why you didn't ask when Yulk was telling you about the Lich. You're not mad, right? No, I was just going to say good work. Second time you've saved us, I said. Thanks. No problem. I take it you don't mind my training routines either. Training routines? I asked. Then several memories of early morning exhaustion flooded back to me. It didn't take long to put two and two together. You've been using my body while I was sleeping? I demanded. You seem angry. I am. My apologies then. It would seem that I misinterpreted one of our previous conversations. I kept my face carefully neutral to mask the baffled anger I was feeling. Thankfully, everyone else was too absorbed in the discussion of intercontinental relations to notice my sudden stoicism. Misinterpreted? How? What the fuck was there to misinterpret? Well, when you apologized, it sort of sounded like you were okay with me taking over your body, so long as it did not rob you of your autonomy. I could grab cheese off the moon with that kind of reach, I thought angrily. How long have you been doing this? Well, I only discovered that I could do it without waking you after our encounter with Mummeldobran and the other fair folk. My impotent anger subsided a bit with the mention of Mummeldobran because it brought up another thought. If languages were different on different continents and the fair folk are usually bound to their territories. No more taking over my body, I thought coldly. But no, not unless we're literally about to die. We'll talk more later. Wait, I said before Ten could reply, interrupting the discussion. Are the fair folk really going to be helpful here? Yes, the Lich answered. Though they rarely travel, the fair folk are interconnected in ways that defy logic. The Fae, in particular, are experts at taking advantage of this connectivity to fulfill the various contracts that they make. Yeah, Rebis laughed. Fulfill? Sure, so long as you're unreasonably careful with your wording. Come on, they'd just as soon rip you off as help you. True, the Lich nodded sagely. That is the nature of dealing with beings that are timeless. It is remarkably difficult to empathize with someone whose potential consequences are vastly different than your own. The skull of the Lich didn't actually change at all, but I got the sense that it was speaking from experience. My attachment to algebra and tits made me want to argue. But what the Lich had said held weight. I tried to imagine what it would be like to be an archfey for a day, and realized that I had no idea what they even do. How do you walk a mile in someone's shoes when you don't even know how to tie their laces? The implication of this also applied to 10, come to think of it. To me, its misinterpretation of my apology seems like a bullshit excuse it thought of to try to get out of trouble. But what if it's not? What if it really was just a misunderstanding? I'll have to think on that some more. Caution is definitely advisable when dealing with the fair folk, Yulk agreed. However, they don't make contracts out of intentional malice. If they hate you enough to be malicious, they'll simply torture or kill you. Speaking of which, I believe I should excuse myself from this leg of the adventure, Olmyra added. Why's that? Rebis asked. The fair folk don't like vampires, Gally said. They'll kill her as soon as they see her. It isn't that they don't like vampires, the Lich countered. No, it's far more complex than that. They see vampirism as suffering and believe that it is an obligatory mercy to put an end to that suffering. That doesn't seem that complex. Rebis cocked his head. The complexity lies within why they view it that way. Though that isn't something I would be comfortable revealing without permission. Larry looked at Olmyra. I'd rather you didn't, she said. I've grown weary of talking about it. The Lich nodded. I's got 'em, Simith interrupted, breathing hard. The rocks with words. Nash and I jumped at the suddenness of the kobold's appearance. Mako chuckled at us as Simith ran over to the Lich. Larry took the tablets with one skeletal hand as his other stroked the kobold's head. Excellent work, Simith. Thank you, he said. The tablets were a light grey, barely lighter than the stone that the walls were made of. An overwhelming feeling of curiosity had my feet moving before my mind even registered it. The tablets were practically calling to me, telling me that they had a clue for me. Larry turned to look at me as I approached. May I see them? I asked. The Lich held out one of the tablets, and I took it. It was surprisingly heavy, and I snuck a glance at the kobold who had carried several of these despite its small stature. I made a mental note not to underestimate the little reptile. Then I turned my attention to the tablet, and my eyes widened. Chapter 69. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7, Human American. Nick? Yulk asked, seeing the shock on my face. I tried to answer him, but couldn't come up with the words. Several feelings swelled up within me all at once, completely overwhelming me. Surprise was chief among them, but also confusion and disappointment. My eyes darted along the characters over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What's wrong? Gally asked. Do you know what it says? No, I managed to say. But this doesn't make any sense. What do you mean? Larry asked. The letters. I know these letters. I grew up writing them over and over again, but they aren't forming words. It's just a bunch of gibberish. The tablet looked like a mosh pit of English letters. Even the lesser-used letters like Z and X were in the fray. For a moment, I thought it could be a language that uses similar letters, but there weren't any diacritical marks. Just plain old English letters grouped together in ways that didn't make any recognizable words. Can I see the rest of the tablets? I asked. Larry gave the tablets to me, and I began scouring them. The letters were jumbled all to hell. Not a single word made sense. There were also hyphens and semicolons spread throughout, but no commas or periods. A sense of frustration began to rise within me. It could be encrypted, Ten said. Maybe. But why? I asked. I hadn't been expecting an answer from Ten, but I was still disappointed when it remained silent. There isn't any need to write in code when nobody else can read the language you're writing. Hold on. Wait, I said excitedly. This could be written in some kind of code. I had thought as much when you said it was gibberish, Larry said, but while knowing that might be helpful, you seem more excited than is to be expected of this revelation. It's a code using the English alphabet. The only reason to write in code is to make sure that others don't understand what you're writing, I explained, meaning that there were other people who knew the English alphabet, and possibly English as well. English is a human language, which means... I trailed off for dramatic effect, and everyone stared at me for a moment. There were other humans here? Mako asked. Exactly, I grinned. But Nick, Yulk said gently, we already knew that there were other humans. Remember the Delver's dungeon? Yeah, but that was different. I was asleep and the other human was insane, but this is evidence that humans were actively communicating with each other and trying to keep secrets from one another. Why else would they bother with a code? There are several disturbing implications that go along with that hypothesis, though, Larry said. First and foremost, it implies that humans were active members of the cult of Malos. If that were true, I feel that someone would have taken note. There's also the fact that the cult disappeared a long time ago, Yulk added. Even if the humans had been a part of the cult and didn't disappear along with the rest of the cult, they would be long dead by now, right? Yulk and Larry seemed to be trying to temper my excitement, but every point they made just caused it to grow. That's actually a really good point, I said. As I understand it, the cult was pretty secretive. What if humans were the leaders of the cult? That would explain why nobody knew about them, and what they were trying to find a way back home. What if the reason that they disappeared is because they succeeded? I wasn't fully sold on that idea, though. King Isinirath had told us that he'd worked to exterminate the cult, and he'd probably have run into a human or two in the process. Unless the leadership had been elsewhere, or he hadn't been paying attention. I don't like that theory, Nash said, crossing his arms. The cult abducted and experimented on people. I'm willing to do a lot of things to help you get home, but I draw the line at harming innocents. I wouldn't hurt innocent people to get home, Nash. But we shouldn't have to, right? What if they wrote down how to get home? What if it's written right here? I pointed at the stone tablet for emphasis. Sam, well, you still need to be able to read the fucking thing, Rebus said. What are we going to do about that? Were there any other writings like this? I asked Larry. Potentially, he answered. There were several other sets of notes, but none that were in legible condition. Damn, I muttered. Why do you ask? Rebus asked. Because ciphers have keys. I hoped someone had written the key somewhere. The moment the words left my mouth, I realized how stupid it would be for someone to just leave something like that lying around. I blame video games. In a video game, the key would be hinted at on a mural within the dungeon or explained in a note next to a dead body. But that's because the people who are making the cipher within a game want you to crack it. Whoever wrote this probably had the opposite intention. Well, I don't know much about codes or secret messages or anything like that. Does anyone know anybody who would be able to help? Gally asked the group. A lot of shrugging and head-shaking followed. Larry and Yulk didn't reply, looking deep in thought. Olmira patted my brother on the shoulder, bringing him back to reality. Oh yes, my apologies, he said. I do know a few scholars who enjoy complex puzzles, but I'm afraid this is likely beyond their capabilities. How come? I asked. Well, solving a code is one thing. Solving a code in a language that you are unfamiliar with and have little to no reference for is another thing entirely. It might be possible, but it would be extremely difficult and would likely take a lifetime. The words of the God thing echoed in my mind. I doubt this is what it meant when it said time isn't a concern. Plus, it wouldn't exactly be entertaining to watch me wait around until someone finally solved this damn code. I stared at the tablet, trying to will the words into existence. Wait, what about you, Ten? I thought to the machine in my brain. I'm afraid that I'm unable to assist you with this task, Ten replied. Why not? I have a fairly sophisticated processor and cooling system, but the processing power I would have to dedicate to this task would be intensive and would come with consequences, namely heat. So you could crack this cipher, but it would cook my brain in the process? Not all of it, just some very important parts of it. Are we suddenly unable to seek help from the Fairfolk? Mako asked. Would they know about this? I replied. Possibly, Larry said. The Fairfolk are an old and wise race of beings. While our ways are as alien to them as their ways are to us, they still watch. And some of them learn. So yes, it's entirely possible that a knowledgeable Fae would be able to shine light on this predicament. So we still have to go talk to the Fae then. Memories of a certain anatomically named archfey played through my mind, and I had to resist the urge to shudder. Tits probably wouldn't be here though, right? I'll be fine, as long as Yulk remembers to keep me updated, Olmira said, mistaking my concerned expression. I'll remember to write, Yulk chuckled. He won't forget, Nash said. I won't let him. "We gonna go see the spooky guys?" Samith asked. "I should bring knife, yes?" "No," Larry replied. "We've lost many, Simith. We must rebuild, and so I want you to go to the kobold caves and find us some reinforcements." "More kobolds?" "Indeed." "All of them?" "Well, no, just those that want to." "What if all want to?" "That's too many." "No, we only want a dozen or so." "Dozen? 2 groups of 7 should do fine," Larry chuckled. "You can do that, right?" "Yeah, am I in one of the groups?" "No." "Okay, so 2 sets of 7 plus me," Samith hopped up and down excitedly. "Go now?" "Yes." "For the Lord," the kobold shouted as he ran out of the room. We stood silently as we listened to his footsteps patter down the entrance hallway. Once they faded, Mako turned to the Lich. "He'll be okay, right?" he asked. "Yes," Larry said. "He's one of the smarter kobolds. Plus, he didn't take a weapon with him, so he'll be extra cautious." "I'd think not taking a weapon would put him more at risk," Hino chimed in. "Only if something is actively hunting him. But kobolds tend to get far more confident when they are armed, and this confidence is often misplaced. He'll be safer without a blade." "Those letters look odd," Ithrima said from over my shoulder, making me jump a little. "Really? Let me see," Rebis said. Everyone except Larry gathered around to have a look, and I lowered the tablets so that they could see them better. Nash and I made eye contact once he looked up from the tablet, and I grinned. "Hey, Nash, maybe you'll be able—" "Shut up," he interrupted with a growl before I could finish the joke. Nash crossed his arms and tried to look intimidating as Yulk and I began to laugh. Everyone else looked confused, but took one look at Nash and decided they didn't want in on the joke. Once Yulk and I had our fill of laughter, Rebis pointed at the tablet. "That looks like an arrowhead," he said, "or maybe a spear tip." "That's an A," I explained. "It's the first letter of the English alphabet." "Very stabby-looking letter. Oh, we have that one," he pointed again. "An EMV. We call that an X. It's the third to last letter." "Your alphabet has a specific order to it?" Hino asked. "Why?" I opened my mouth to answer but found myself at a loss. The hesitation I felt turned into a small existential crisis as it dawned on me that I can't think of any real reason the alphabet is in that order. Maybe it's historical. Or, "I think it's because it's easier to teach it if it is in a certain order," I said. "There's a song and everything." I sang the alphabet song for them, and my demonstration left everyone speechless for a bit. "Humans have singing scholars?" Ithrima asked. "Huh? Oh, I guess. Technically. Those scholars are usually children, though," I replied. "Kids love to sing, and teaching them the alphabet song helps them remember the alphabet. Or the names of the letters, at least." More questions about public education followed, and I answered them to the best of my abilities. Everyone seemed impressed, except Yulk and Nash. They'd heard it all before. "Well, that would certainly be better for the little ankle-biters than hawking goods in the street," Rebis said. "Or the mines," Mako added. "Nah, kids long for the mines." "They most certainly do not," Ithrima argued. I almost agreed with her, but decided to keep quiet once I remembered how popular a certain video game was back home. Even I loved it, but grew out of it when I became a teenager. Maybe kids really do long for the mines. The conversation about public schooling continued for some time, culminating with Yulk and Ithrima discussing how such a system could be implemented. I answered a few more questions, but had difficulty pulling my attention from the tablets in my hands. Larry noticed my distraction and interrupted the conversation. "While this exploration of another world's educational systems is illuminating, I do believe we should see the Fae sooner rather than later," he said. "If we leave now, you may make it back to town before nightfall." "That's a good point," Gali said. "All right, let's get going." After a chorus of agreements, we began to make our way out of the dungeon. Larry disintegrated the fallen kobolds as we passed, silently praying for them. We all bowed our heads in respect as well. Finally, we left the dungeon. Fresh air flushed the stench of death from my nose, and I inhaled deeply. Unfortunately, the smell had gotten into my clothes, so I gagged. That got a few laughs, but those quickly died out once everyone realized that they also stank. "This is where we part ways," Elmira smiled. "I hope to see you all again someday." We will look you up the next time we're in Bolisir, Nash said, and I'll make sure Yulk keeps you updated. I won't need a reminder, Yulk added. I hope you have a safe journey. You too. With a wave, Elmira began heading back to town. The terrain can be treacherous, Larry said. Watch your step, or you may injure your ankles. The Lich then left the trail, and the rest of us followed after him into the forest. Chapter 69.5 Master Vampire Kirain Yeath. Adventurer Level NA. Drow Master Vampire Balushinian. A miserable failure, my mind whispered. The void had once again enveloped me, but this time there was a sense of hostility to it that I found unnerving. It made me feel as if I were prey for a hungry and angry beast. Why am I here? I demanded, forcing my unease aside. What happened? You were defeated, cast down by a novice better described as a child than an adult. I had such high hopes for you, and you have thoroughly disappointed me. So this is the afterlife? No, you've managed to survive by the skin of your teeth, or rather, the skin behind your teeth. Tiresome riddles. I found myself struggling to make sense of what the higher being was saying. Then my eyes saw the fight play out before me. The creature had burned me severely, and I had ripped off my tongue and cast it aside. I felt it all again, but knew it wasn't real. This was the higher being explaining what it meant. As long as any of my organs survive the flames, I can regenerate. After our fight, the intruders and the Lich had burned my arm, my body, and even the flesh I had torn off. But they had missed my tongue laying next to the throne. Actually, so had I. So what do you want from me now? I asked. Nothing. You did your best and failed. I can try again. You will fail again. No, this time I will be better prepared. I now know what that thing is capable of. I can take precautions. I can kill it. The hostility of the void increased, burning my flesh with its intensity. No, not my flesh. My essence, pain, more intense than any I had ever felt before, coursed throughout my very being. I tried to scream, but had no mouth to do so. I tried to beg, but the words couldn't form. Suddenly, it stopped. Perhaps it may be amusing to see you try again, the voice taunted me. So you'll let me go? I asked. I hadn't planned on holding you here, just tormenting you until you met your grisly end. Instead, I will discuss this with the others. If they agree, I will intercede and save you from what's to come. If not, we'll leave you to your fate. And what am I to do in the meantime? You will wait. Chapter 70. High Chief Ulamak. Adventurer level, not applicable. Orc. Kirkenian. My gaze washed over the former battlefield with satisfaction. Drow corpses and weapons were scattered everywhere, with nary an injured dwarf, elf, or orc in sight. We'd definitely taken some casualties, but we cleaned up after ourselves nicely. Our enemy, on the other hand, didn't get the chance to. A job well done, if I say so myself. I even got to fight a bit. Of course, fighting on an arseback isn't exactly my favorite kind of brawl, but beggars can't be choosers. King Lofin's finest had retreated into the city and were already on the walls, taking poorly aimed potshots at us. The walls were imposingly large, but had definitely seen better days. Probably built by the vampires when they held the city, and not at all maintained by the inbred bastard king or his forefathers. The steady sound of Hanasa hooves galloping behind me brought me out of my contemplations. My Hanas, a warrior bred for size and strength, huffed at the inconvenience of my weight shifting as I turned to get a look. I patted the poor beast on the head while Blagroth's Hanas approached us. Just got word that Emperor Jack has made it back home safely, sir, Blagroth reported. Once Jack, Markiv, and I had finished our strategy meeting, the Dwarven Emperor had decided to leave the rest of the fight in the hands of his top general. Then he went home, leaving the vast majority of the army he'd brought along with him in my care. Things had moved pretty quickly after that. Messengers had been sent out to all the great chiefs declaring war on the Night Kingdom, and not a single protest was sent in reply. As a matter of fact, many of the great chiefs sent their best mer to join me. That, combined with the surprising competency of Jack's general, made things a whole lot easier than they otherwise would have been. General Jakiv, who also happened to be Jack's youngest cousin, Didn't get to where he is from nepotism, or maybe he did. But he's still a damn fine strategist as well as a natural leader. Were it not for Jack II, Jakiv would likely be a strong candidate for the throne. Plus, he and General Markiv were getting along famously. All of this had made the campaign into the Night Kingdom. Well, for lack of a better word, fun. Leading a war band against an incompetent foe with competent allies, what could be more elating for an orc such as I? Unfortunately, it had only taken us a week to push the Drow forces back to their capital. Not going to be long until I'm back in the office. Good to hear. How are the preparations going? I asked. The boulder tossers are nearly finished, and we've got some decent boulders to chuck, sir. Jakiv and Markiv are ready for the assault when we are. Blagroth cracked his neck. By the way, sir, are they related? Jakiv and Markiv? Not that I know of. Why? No real reason. Their names sound similar is all. I stared at the brawny young infantryman for a moment, trying to judge whether he was serious or not. No sly winks or hidden smiles gave it away. One's an elf and the other is a dwarf. Ah. I said, trying not to sound condescending. Yeah, but elves and dwarves can have babies. And them babies usually look like one or the other, so you can't really tell. I've seen a dwarf and elf be brothers from the same parents, sir. Okay, but one is cousin to the Emperor of Calcuti, and the other is a high-ranking general in the army of Bolisir, I argued. That's a lot of distance apart, and they're leading different armies. But Bolisir and Calcuti are on friendly terms, so it wouldn't be unheard of for a powerful family to have positions of power in both nations, sir. Not only was he serious, but he now had me doubting Jakiv's and Markiv's familial origins. What I had initially believed to be an ignorant assumption turned out to be a well-thought-out question that I don't have a good answer for. I can see why High Chief Olmag lent him to me. I'll have to give the city of Havros a tax cut as way of thanks. Well, all I know is that they aren't related, I said with a shrug. At least not closely. Changing the subject, I need you to spread the word. Once the boulder tossers are ready and loaded, they're going to fire 3 volleys, which should open up the walls. Nobody is to charge until the 3rd volley is in the air. Right, or else we'll be squashing our own. Blagroth nodded sagely. What do we do if 3 volleys isn't enough to bring down a good enough portion of the wall? It should. These walls aren't exactly the best on the continent, I chuckled. But, yeah, if the walls somehow stand up to the volleys, or if we miss, just call a retreat. So charge once the 3rd volley is in the air. If the wall doesn't fall, retreat. Easy, right? Sounds like a plan, sir. Blagroth turned his hnass and rode off. My own was absent-mindedly picking at the grass. He huffed another complaint as I picked up the reins and steered him toward my encampment. Despite his hesitancy and my weight, we made good time getting back. I sighed internally as my tent came into view. One of the biggest and gaudiest damn pieces of fabric I've ever seen rose above all of the others surrounding it, telling everyone who had eyes exactly where the High Chief sleeps at night. Even the tents of the great chiefs who managed to catch up to us were tiny in comparison. If the Drow were a more capable foe, it would be fucking stupid to show them exactly where to strike. Thankfully, they don't stand a chance of getting this far behind our lines. The dour mood brought on by the sight of my tent disappeared when I saw who was hanging out with the guards surrounding it. Olmag, glad you decided to join us, I shouted and waved. Gracefully, I slid off my hnaasa, the ground shuddering slightly as I landed. It could be my imagination, but I swear the Nas sighed in relief before it trotted off to join the others at the stable. I strode up to Olmag and grasped his outstretched forearm. Wouldn't miss it for my wedding, High Chief, he laughed. How's Blagroth? Has he been making himself useful? He has. All compliments, no complaints. He's been acting as my second in command and doing a damn good job of it. Didn't catch his rank, though. Oh, that's because we don't really do ranks in Havros. You're either a chief or you aren't. Good to hear that he's been taking initiative, though. What happened to your original second in command? Well, I left Razon handling administrative stuff in Kirkina, and Homlane became ill on the 2nd day of the campaign. Blagroth was already helping Homlane by then, so he just stepped into the role like it was nothing. Yeah, that sounds like him, Olmag chuckled. So, I take it the rats are hiding in their den. Ha, Comparing these cowards to the mighty beasts that roam the wastes is an insult to the rats. But yes, the drow are cowering behind their walls. Not to worry, though. I brought siege equipment, I said with a grin. Boulder tossers, which are currently being assembled, and hook ladders. Yes, I know that too. I was wondering if you could be the first over and/or through the wall. Oh, yeah. Nope. What? Every great chief here wants to be the first. Even I want to be first. We all had a shouting match earlier, and it became apparent that nobody will be satisfied with a compromise. So, I trailed off and shrugged a little. So nobody gets to go first? Exactly. We'll all be leading from the back. But the troops are aware of the situation. If they're upset that they get to protect their chiefs, they aren't showing it. Also, if it will be of any comfort, I'm willing to explain the situation to your soldiers. Nah, if you explain it to them, I don't get to bitch to them about it. Olmag laughed. So how come we don't all go first, together? And 'cause some of the great chiefs shouldn't be on the front lines at all, I replied, with a malicious grin. 'Cause they haven't chosen their successors yet. Oh, Olmag deflated a little. If a great chief were to fall here without a successor, there would definitely be a civil war. Could be a war between their hopeful successors, or the other great chiefs may bring up age-old claims and start trouble. Or both, actually. I know, High Chief. Either way, it will be a blow to the unified chiefdoms. A blow which I am responsible for preventing. Yes, High Chief, He trailed off, then looked inspired. Wait, what about Blagroth? Huh? I asked, dumbfounded. Blagroth can be my successor. You said he's been doing real good, right? You can't choose your successor on the battlefield, I shouted, especially from those who may also fall in battle. Oh, come on, High Chief, he's perfect. Olmag grinned. No, you will do this the right way or not at all, godsdammit. There's traditions to uphold, feasts and such. A good successor deserves at least that much. I crossed my arms angrily. Plus, you're not the only great chief to have been lazy with choosing your successor. Fuck. Yep, so we'll all hang out in the back, safe and sound. All right, he sighed. I'll go and tell the boys. Oh wait, when are we charging? Not long now. I'll wait until you're ready to give the order for the boulder tossers to fire, though. Once the third volley is in the air, we charge. If the rocks don't make room for us in the walls, we're going to retreat and throw more. But you brought ladders, right? Yeah, but we don't want to use them if we don't have to. Numerically, we've got a fairly even fight, but if we get caught up in choke points, that can change damn quick. With how they fight, it isn't as if we would take that many losses. I don't like spending lives that we don't have to spend, Olmag, I said with a solemn shake of my head. Yeah, that's why you're the High Chief, I guess, Olmag said, then grinned again. Plus the fact that you're fucking enormous. You old fucker, I said with a laugh. Don't you got some soldiers to talk to? He laughed and walked away with a wave. I smiled and shook my head. I nodded at the guards stationed around my tent, but they ignored me, continuing their vigil as I entered. Once inside, I unbuckled my sheath and set the hefty blade down upon the planning table, which hadn't seen a lot of use. There were conflicts in the past where it had seemed like I'd been at this table for the entire duration. But this time, we'd made a plan and it had worked. The drow had been even less prepared for a counter-invasion than I had hoped. They'd fallen for every trap and tactic that we'd thrown at them, and now they were going to lose the capital. The only real hiccup we had run into so far was the thrice-damned vampires. The first few villages we took were absolutely lousy with the bastards. So much so that Makiv had wondered aloud if King Lofin had even tried to exterminate the fuckers. There had also been some skirmishes with vampire brood. Deadly beasts, but no match for well-trained soldiers supported by mages. Even less deadly to mages on Heinar's back. I chuckled as I imagined the enemy's first reaction to our magical cavalry. Hi, Chief, a voice called from outside my tent. Scout Lion has a report for you. Lion, an orc from a small village who had a knack for learning new surroundings and spotting minor details. They'd done so well as a scout during the invasion of Blurpus that Great Chief Tormund had insisted that I take her under my wing. Though I was glad she made it back in one piece, a small sense of dread rose up within me as I remembered her assignment. Enter, I said, taking a seat. The tent flap opened, and an orc just over half my size and covered head to toe in cloak and hood entered. Lion removed her hood, and her long light brown hair fell across the back of her cloak. She knelt, and that very same hair covered her face. "O highest of chiefs," she said sarcastically, "I have come to deliver unto you—" "Oh, come on," I interrupted. "Enough with the theatrics. Get up and report." "Yes, sir," she chuckled as she rose. "I take it you've got good news if you're being so playful." "Oh no, not at all," she said as her demeanor shifted. "I thought my little performance would ease the blow, as it were." The small sense of dread grew larger. "Report," I said coldly. "I found the vampires," she replied, all sense of levity gone. "They are amassing in the east." "Amassing? How many?" "At least 10,000 brood, likely more, but I couldn't get close enough to count all of them. There's also a few dozen vampires among them." "How could you tell?" "The brood don't eat vampires," she shuddered. "That's the only meat they won't eat, it seems. She trailed off, staring at the floor. I'd seen plenty of monsters feed off of people before, and I knew how many nightmares it takes to forget such a sight. "I understand, Lion," I said softly. "I'm sorry you had to see that." "Wish I could say that I've seen worse, High Chief," she replied, "but only if that meant what I saw wasn't as bad as it was. They're ravishing the countryside, and preparing to march. Shit. Yeah." "Any hints as to where they came from?" I asked. "No, sir. It's like they just popped up from the ground or something." My thoughts turned to the reports from the invasion of Blurpus. The commander had been a half-breed drow vampire and had the captured orcs dig out a chamber of horrors beneath the village they took. I wonder how many villages here in the Night Kingdom had a similar pit beneath them. "I need Makiv and Jakiv," I said. "Yes, sir, I thought so too. Sent a runner the moment I hit camp. They should be here, so—" "Sir, the generals are here for you," one of the guards said from outside. "Send them in," I commanded and stood, strapping my sword back on. Both Makiv and Jakiv hurried into the tent. "A vampire army," Makiv said. "Never thought I'd see the day." "It isn't outside of my expectations," I replied. "Figured there'd be a host of them somewhere. However, the size of it is concerning." 6,000 against 10,000, Jakiv added. "It'll be a close thing." "Lion, set the marker," I said. Lion moved to the table and picked up a piece of stone that was painted red. She stared at the map for a moment, then placed the stone upon it. "Very good. If there's nothing else, you're dismissed." She nodded and left the tent as the generals approached the table. I stared at the new red marker, demonstrating a large enemy host to our east. Something about it. "It's fairly far, thankfully," Makiv said. "Gives us time to prepare." "Not much," Jakiv replied. "We can't turn our back on these walls, else we invite the Drow's daggers." "Indeed," I agreed. "Splitting our forces in two would weaken us too much as well. So we stick to our current plan. Take the city, then fortify it the vampires." "Would Lofin surrender if we told him about this?" "No, he would never do something so smart," Makiv chuckled. "Either he wouldn't believe us, and we'd have to fight anyway, or he'd betray us the first chance he got." "We would also lose precious time waiting for a reply," I added. Then noticed Jakiv shifting uncomfortably. "What's wrong?" "I rode here in due haste," he replied. "Didn't allow time for my harness to be saddled. I am pained." Makiv and I nodded knowingly. Riding a harness without a saddle is a pain that is known to most who have learned to ride. Many riding instructors consider it a rite of passage to have their pupils experience this unique type of injury. The pain is immediate, but then fades a few moments after you dismount the harness. Then it comes back with a vengeance, seemingly clawing at your insides and causing nausea as it goes. "I do hope someone's bringing your saddle," Makiv said with a chuckle. "Yes, but never mind me. What do we do once we take the city?" "We'll worry about the walls first and foremost. Once we're in the walls, we'll get to work plugging the holes," I explained. "It'll take the vampires a day or so to get here from all the way over there, so we can use the mages to help take the city. Once everything's settled down, we'll put the mages who know fire magic on whichever sections of wall survive our assault." "Should also have archers with flaming arrows," Jakiv added. "The city should have enough pitch." I'm concerned about a potential vampiric presence within the city, Makiv said. Getting attacked from both sides of the wall would be devastating. We'll need to have patrols, assuming that we are confining the civilians until everything settles down. That's not a bad idea, but each patrol will have to have some way of permanently ending a vampire. Torches could do, but they're easily extinguished. Mages would be the best option, but each mage we send on a patrol is a mage who can't be on the wall. Damn. Wait. Infantry patrols with torches and whistles, I said. They will be supported by a rapid response force of mounted mages. That should prevent an attack on two fronts. Good plan, Makiv nodded. We'll see it done, High Chief. Gods, though, I don't like how close that army is to Bolasir. I glanced at the marker on the map and my eyebrows rose. Makiv was right, it was only about 2 days' march from the border of Bolasir. Maybe we'll get lucky and they'll march on Bolasir instead, I chuckled. King Isinerath is far better equipped to deal with them than we are. That's true, Makiv said with a laugh. I suppose I worry for nothing. Yeah, I said, something about the map still nagging at me. All right, same plan as before. Once the third volley is in the air, we charge. If there isn't a big enough hole for us, we pull back and launch another one. Makiv and Jakiv agreed and left, but I barely noticed them go. I hadn't seen it before, but the position of the vampiric host reminded me of a conversation I had with that human. The vampires were more than a day's march away from us, and at least 2 days away from Bolasir. But they were also only half a day away from the deep wild forest.